What's up, guys? It's D22-soso, Wayne Chung of the Professional Gamer Podcast is my VIP guest. Brian Weissman.
Hi, guys.
I've mentioned in previous podcasts and in Live with Mike Poker commentary I do that he is one of my Magic the Gathering mentors. You have so many accolades, I don't even know. So in the beginning, we were in Palo Alto, and around 1996, 95, 96, like I met you. You were already kind of the alpha guy in Magic. You were the creator of the deck, Blue White Control, and then you did well in the Pro Tours. You were one of the early pioneers of professional gaming in that era, and then you moved on to, I think, Diablo 2.
Not as a professional thing. Diablo, I mean, it wasn't initially a professional thing. It began obviously as just a gaming endeavor. I played Diablo 1 a ton, as did pretty much every person, every male of my generation. But when Diablo 2 came out, I think it came out in 1999, I was just immediately sucked into that game. But I only played it as a gaming endeavor for a while. And in fact, it wasn't until Endeavor was actually a real-time game before Magic came out. It was the game Street Fighter, which I think I told you about. I was a competitive Street Fighter player as much as you could be that in the early 1990s through the late part of my high school and then at the beginning of my college as well. This was like, if for people who are Street Fighter aficionados, and if there are gamers watching this, there are probably people who care about this, obviously, and have followed the chronology of those games. But in 1992, the version of Street Fighter that was out was actually my favorite version of the game. It was Super Street Fighter 2. It was just called Super Street Fighter 2. So the original game was, well, obviously there was original Street Fighter, which is just garbage. But Street Fighter 2 came out in, I think, around 1989 or 1990, and was followed subsequently by Champion Edition, then by Hyper Fighting. And then the version that came out after that, the first official version that came out, was called Super Street Fighter 2. And it was the one that introduced the 4 new characters beyond the original, I guess, 12. So I think Super Street Fighter 2 has 16 characters in it. It included DJ, Cammy, T-Hawk, and Fei Long. And the game has balance issues and it is very slow, which is something I liked about it. But it was an amazing game. And it was, for me, that was the first time to really devote a lot of my time, particularly because I was out of high school now and I actually could spend more time doing this. So I threw a lot of time at Super Street Fighter 2. And I happened to be playing and competing at what was actually, we didn't know this until people began to travel around and there was more internet communication a few years later. But there was one particular place in Golfland in Sunnyvale, the Sunnyvale Golfland, which was located in, people don't know where Sunnyvale is. It's near San Jose in California. And it just happened to be the nexus for Super Street Fighter 2 play in all of Northern California, which by extension made it the nexus of Street Fighter play pretty much for the entire United States. There was one pocket of really, really good players down in Southern California, where a couple of really legendary players also were competing. Those two locations really defined competitive Street Fighter play for a long period of time. And to this day, there are people who are still very prominent in that world, in that gaming world, who were competitors back in that era. So I was objectively not anywhere near one of the best players there. I would say I was probably top 12 maybe on a good day, because there were a lot of extremely good players. But because of who I competed against, I had prodigious skill relative to most other pockets of players, because just like in Magic and in many other games, you can only get a little bit better than the people you compete against. You can't really get a ton better unless you go up against more stalwart competition. It's just too hard. So I was a competitive Street Fighter player when I moved to Santa Cruz to go to school. I started there in 1992. Didn't hear about Magic all through 1993, although it came out in, I think it formally came out in August, although it had debuted at Gen Con in July of 1993. But as a consequence of the fact that the company that was producing it, Wizards of the Coast, which is actually, you can almost see it from my house out that way, in Renton. Wizards of the Coast was a tiny little company that was started by a guy named Peter Atkinson, who was a gamer himself, and he didn't have a lot of resources. So he was looking for products to go and promote to increase his business. And he happened to have struck up a friendship with Magic's creator, a guy named Richard Garfield. And Peter was basically pitched an idea to Richard and said, we really need a game that people can play for 15, 20 minutes at a time at a convention or something, at a gaming convention where they're going to play tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons or whatever. And Richard had this game that he had been developing kind of off and on. And I know Richard really well, actually. He's quite a good friend of mine, and he lives in Bellevue, which is just on the other side of Lake Washington over here.
I met him in 1990, before I won anything in Starcraft, but I was already a top player. I met him at E3, and Scaff Elias, I believe his name.
Yeah, Scaff Elias. Yeah. Scaff Elias is a very close friend of his. They're actually still business partners to this day. He has a company called Three Donkeys, and Scaff and Richard are two of those three donkeys. And Scaff also still lives in Bellevue. I see him periodically as well. Scaff's role his primary role as far as Magic is concerned, in addition to being one of the initial developers, one of the initial testers of the alpha set, helped with the development of early Magic sets. But Scaff's main contribution was that he was the guy who's credited with coming up with Pro Tour, which in 1996 seemed like a tough sell, particularly because Magic the Gathering, anybody that's ever, I saw these actually a couple of days ago, unfortunately, but one of the biggest conundrums facing the company, Wizard of the Coast, was how do we promote this game to the masses? Because Magic pretty much propagated virally through the early internet. That's how most people found out about it. But of course, you didn't really have much of the internet until 1996, 1997. The game came out in 1993.
95, at least in Palo Alto, and you went to Palo Alto High School, I went to Gun High School. That's where it was already on the uptrend, and it just, the first 5 years skyrocketed, yeah. On
what was called the Usenet at the time. And so for people who use the internet today generally have no inkling of the way that the internet looked before it was a website that you would log into, before there were browsers like Firefox, for example, or Chrome or Safari or whatever. When you logged into the internet before, you would log in with your modem and you'd have to type in this very intricate long address for a particular news group or discussion that you wanted to go and converse about. So in the case of Magic, you had to know that you would log into rec.games.tradingcards.deckmaster.magic.marketplace or .strategy or something. You had to type all that in just to get access to talk to people about the game. So it's really, really very, very hard for anybody who wasn't extremely internet savvy to even tap into that world at all to learn anything about it. So I didn't do anything related to the internet at all and Magic itself for quite a while, for a couple of years. And people were playing Street Fighter competitively, and people were talking about Street Fighter strategy on the Usenet as well, which I didn't know anything about. And obviously there was a big overlap between those demographics. But when I went to Santa Cruz, getting back to what I was saying about the game coming out in I think formally in July, and then it debuted at Gen Con with a set called Alpha, which they were barely able to print at all, because Wizard of the Coast was a tiny little company. And a lot of people look back at the early Magic sets, Alpha, Beta, Unlimited, Arabian Nights, Legends, and so on, and they go, or Antiquities, and they go, why the hell did they make more of this stuff? Clearly they could sell every single pack that they produced times 10, and they didn't hardly make anything. And it was entirely just economics. It was basically the fact that they wanted to print more, but they literally spent every single dollar that they had. So when they printed Alpha, they took all the money they made from Alpha and they printed Beta with that. And they took all the money from Beta and they printed Unlimited and Arabians and so on. And in fact, I had lunch with Peter Atkinson, the former CEO and founder of Wizard of the Coast, about a year ago. And he relayed several really cool stories to me about the very early parts of the early days of the game. One of them was, he asked me to guess how much they spent collectively on the entire print run of Arabian Nights, what the entire print run of Arabian Nights cost. If you had to hazard a guess, what would you guess? It cost them to make every single card that they printed for that set.
Couldn't even guess. $8,000.
It's a low ball. I would have guessed higher than that, substantially higher. I would have guessed probably $250,000. Turns out it was only $80,000 to print every single Arabian Nights card, which incidentally is the cost today of about 40 sealed packs of Arabian Nights on the secondary market. They're about $2,000 each if you get them out of a box.
I guess really low because you said they were like leveraging, so it was. Oh
yeah, they were everything was just rolled back in. So if you look at the sort of exponential growth of Magic availability, you can see that in action based on how much of each subsequent set gets printed. So for example, the print run of Alpha was so low that there was something around 1,000 of every alpha rare were printed initially. So if you have an alpha Black Lotus, you have one of 1,000. And those are obviously originally, of course, some large subset of those original alpha Lotuses were lost or destroyed because people played without sleeves, and there was no inkling of that the cards would ever have value, long-term value. Certainly no one would ever envision that there could be alpha Black Lotuses out there worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Individual single alpha Black Lotus is worth that much. The beta was printed roughly 3 times. There were roughly 3 times as many beta cards printed as alpha. And then by the time that Unlimited came along, they were able to increase the print run by, I think, 3 to 4 times that. So it's around 14 to 15,000 of every Unlimited rare. But Arabian Nights had a tiny little print run compared to it. I remember when Legends came out, and I was going to UC Santa Cruz at the time. They were rationing Legends to 2 packs per person, and there was a line that went all the way through the Santa Cruz downtown for people to line up to buy 2 packs, and people were bribing people on the street to go in and buy them 2 packs and so on, because everyone was so starved for product.
So if we remember in Legends, Superstars, which is now Channel Fireball, owned by John Sasso, Mana Drain, one of the key cards in Legends, John Sasso sold it for 75 cents, and everyone was in uproar. How can an uncommon be 75 cents?
How outrageous that was. Insane.
Yeah.
Well, Mana Drain, I mean, obviously it's one of those cards like Sarah Angel and Soul Ring that people were incredulous about the fact that because at the very beginning, no one even knew what rarities were. None of the rarities were published. Nowadays, obviously, spoilers come out weeks in advance of the set coming out. Everything has an expansion symbol and a color. So it's really clear. And they were very reluctant to actually even have, this is something that Richard Garfield cared about at some point, because I'm not really sure what was driving it really. I think that he really wanted for the game to have a sense of mystery to it. And he felt like disclosing spoilers and disclosing rarities removed that sense of mystery from it, from the whole process of opening up booster packs, which I'm sure you experienced. I remember this myself, opening up packs and seeing cards I'd never seen before, and really, it was palpably exciting. And you would play matches against people and they would have cards you'd never seen before, and that was really exciting too. So that was sort of part of his vision. And I think that not having rarities that were clearly communicated to the player was part of that. So people would look at cards like Soul Ring and Sarah Angel, 2 of the best cards in Alpha, and Icy Manipulator and Demonic Tutor, and they would go, what? This is so good. This clearly has to be a rare card. And Mana Drain, obviously, Mana Drain is, I mean, I think unequivocally the best card in all of Legends. It's the strongest card in Legends, and it's an uncommon. And on top of that, Legends had this issue with A and B boxes, where half of the print run of Legends, the sheets that those boxes were that they cut up and then put into the packs that went into those boxes, half of the boxes did not have Mana Drain in them. You could not get a Mana Drain in half the boxes. The other half had double the number of Mana Drains that you normally would have expected. But yeah, because they just had this weird collation error to this day, all the Legends boxes still have it. And there's no way to tell. There's literally no way to tell, as far as I know, if you have an A or a B box. Maybe it's the serial number on the bottom, because it's probably correlated to that about when it was made. I don't know. The quality control in the early days of the game was just abysmal. I mean, utterly abysmal. The fact that Alpha was just missing 2 cards. It's missing Volcanic Island and Circle Protection Black. They're just not in the set. But anyway, so to get back to your initial question, 1994 rolls around and I haven't heard of the game. I'm still competing in Street Fighter all the time. And because I was living in Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz is, it's 2 or 3 bus rides and a train ride away from my hometown, which is Palo Alto. Of course, obviously you're very familiar with Palo Alto because we played there a ton. And I used to go on weekends to commute back to Palo Alto to see my girlfriend at the time. And on one of those weekends in January of 1994, I attended a friend of mine's birthday party, who was turning, I guess, 20 or 21 at the time. I think he was turning 20. And one of our mutual friends had been introduced to Magic about a month beforehand. I'm not sure how, but he brought 2 starter decks of Unlimited as a birthday present from my friend who was the birthday boy. And he brought his own collection, and 4 of them sat on the floor of the birthday boy's bedroom at his house and started playing a game of Magic, a 4-way game of Magic, while I kind of watched from the sidelines. And they were playing, and I had no interest in it at all, 0, because we had all these outdoor activities planned. We were planning on playing, I don't know, capture the flag. We had like physical activities planned outdoors. think Ultimate Frisbee possibly, and the game was just dragging on and on and on and on. It went on for over an hour. And finally, after they finished their first game and started playing another one, I kind of said, all right, well, maybe I should try it myself. So I convinced one of my friends to go downstairs and play an introductory game of Magic with me on the kitchen table in my friend's kitchen. And I won my first game of Magic, and I felt like there was something here. Like it immediately resonated with me. Something clicked, and I was really interested in it. So I didn't have a lot of money at the time, but I went down to a local comic store called Comics and Comics in South Palo Alto. Do you remember where California Avenue is?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. There's two main downtowns in Palo Alto, in the north and the south. And I guess the southern downtown is California Avenue.
Yeah.
And Comics and Comics was there, and they just happened to have unlimited starters when almost no stores had them, which was a real stroke of luck, actually, in retrospect, because at that point, nearly the whole world was sold out of Magic product. It was almost impossible to find.
Wow.
But I bought two starters, and in one of the first starter, I got a Royal Assassin, which was a really, really big deal. Royal Assassin was one of the first two made, long before anyone cared about Black Lotus. Royal Assassin was one of the two cards you really, really wanted to get. Yeah, that and Ship and Dragon, of course. And I took my cards, and I went back to Santa Cruz, and my first thought was, I need to show this to my really, really good friend, this guy named Matt Wallace, who I don't think you ever met, actually. I don't know if you ever met Matt.
Doesn't sound familiar.
Well, Matt and I met playing competitive Street Fighter. So we were friends in the context of playing Street Fighter together. And I knew that based on Matt's analytical mind and his general gaming skills, that he would really, really love Magic too. And so I introduced him to the game. As expected, he totally loved it. And most importantly, he had disposable income and a car. Critical. I didn't have a car. I didn't even have a driver's license. So I was really, really limited in my ability to move around, which was a problem because at the time it was so difficult to even find cards anywhere on Earth. It was so tough to find them. People had them in their collections and you could trade, but people were really reluctant to trade because there was no defined value for anything. So there was no universal agreement about what anything was worth. And people would very frequently do trades and then find out that they had been totally ripped off and felt taken advantage of. I certainly was guilty of on the receiving end of those kinds of transactions numerous times. And but Matt had a car, so we could drive around. We could drive around the Santa Cruz area. We could go south all the way down to Gilroy, doing anything to try to get cards. And meanwhile, we were just working on frantically just building deck after deck after deck after deck after deck. And the origin story for the term "the deck," because a lot of people that term has endured for now 26 years to present day. There's an archetype that's probably it's certainly one of the top three most prominently and frequently played archetypes in the current version of decks from that era. Are you familiar with old school? The deck was co-developed by Matt and me for running in the run-up to an event that was held, I think, in May of 1994. A huge tournament held in San Francisco called Manifest. And I guess Manifest, that was the first time that Manifest had been held specifically for Magic, because obviously in May of 1993, the game hadn't come out yet. So in the run-up to the event, Matt and I had been really working frantically for, at that point, I guess 3 or 4 months we were doing nothing else as we were college students, but we were really doing nothing else but just playing Magic all day long and trying every sort of thing. And we had run the gamut of all these different strategies. We had built a deck around land destruction. It was called the land destruction deck. We had built a deck around Chain Lightning and Lightning Bolt and Sonic Blast and Black Vice and Stormseeker that we called the direct damage deck. And we had built the protection deck, which was basically just a bunch of circles of protection and moats and abysses, and basically trying to build this crazy fortress that just locked your opponent out of the game. And then we had built the permission deck, which was a mono blue thing that just had every counterspell that we owned. And we had tried all these different iterations, but gradually began to figure out these sort of fundamental underlying mechanics in Magic that kind of came up over and over and over again in our testing. Certainly it indicated that color blue had a big advantage over all the other colors in the game. That was readily apparent fairly early on, but we weren't quite sure of exactly what it was. We couldn't really put our finger on it. But what I started to notice was that in game after game after game that Matt and I played, the person who wound up drawing the most cards throughout the game tended to win. It wasn't a certainty, but if you drew more cards than your opponent, you tended to win the game, and it didn't really tend to matter how you accomplished that goal. And so to further that aim, we really started focusing on things that dealt directly with the card advantage, as it came to be known, the card advantage aspect of the game. Either drawing more cards than your opponent or making your opponent discard lots of cards. Because we actually were able to sort of make the mental leap that cards, it's sort of analogous to poker, about how money you save on a bet is the same thing as money earned. They're interchangeable. And in Magic, it's not exactly that cut and dry, but making your opponent discard is almost as powerful as drawing extra cards.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's way more powerful depending on the timing. Card drawing is more consistently powerful throughout the game, but discard is overwhelmingly powerful at the start of the game before your opponent gets a mana based and gets fortified in the game and they're actually able to do anything. And at the time, there were 2 key cards that were unrestricted based on the restricted list of the day. And they had actually, even without really having the internet, the restricted list that was curated by Wizards of the Coast had kind of made its way out into the ecosystem. And so, for example, the Black Lotus at that point was understood as a restricted card. So were the Moxes. But there were 2 huge outliers. One of them was the Library of Alexandria, which is an absurd land. It's not the most powerful land ever printed because they made some crazier lands later. But in the context of the game of the day, it's easily the strongest. It's probably the purely strongest card in the format, period. At least in terms of raw power. I don't think it's the best card, and that's sort of a semantic debate between the best and the strongest.
Do you remember your nickname for it?
What was it?
You called it the cheater card.
Yeah, I mean, you call it whatever you want. I mean, to this day, I have mostly a hate relationship with the card. I can't stand it, honestly, because I find it more than anything in the contemporary version of constructed Magic from that era, which I mentioned before is called old school or 93, 94 Magic. The Library of Alexandria is still a ubiquitous problem. It's in most decks, and it counterfeits a sizable portion of games. It just shows up and one person just runs away with the game from turn 1 while the other person just watches them draw 2 cards a turn. The card basically, it taps to add 1 generic mana. It was known as colorless mana back in the day. And its secondary ability is that if you have exactly 7 cards in hand, you can tap the Library of Alexandria to draw another card. And because consistently the most important thing you do every single turn in a game of Magic is draw that card at the beginning of the turn, this singular land allows you to take 2 turns to every one of your opponent's 1 turns, which is just absolutely ridiculous in general, and particularly for the cost of a single land drop. It barely costs you anything to even include it in the deck. So Library was unrestricted. You could play with 4 copies in your deck at the time. And then on the opposite side of the coin, there was a black sorcery called Mind Twist, which was an initial black mana to start, and then whatever additional mana you invest in the card are random cards that your opponent has to discard. So early in the game, if you go turn 1, land, Soul Ring, Black Lotus, you Mind Twist them for 4 on the first turn. They only start with 7 cards. They lose 4 of them at random. That could be all of their resources. You know, they kept a great hand that has 3 land in it, and you Mind Twist away all 3 land. They literally can do nothing. So getting back to what I was saying about how discard at the beginning of the game is overwhelmingly strong. Well, Mind Twist was unrestricted too. You could play with 4 copies of that as well. So Matt and I put together this deck that had 4 Libraries of Alexandria and 4 copies of Mind Twist and 4 copies of Mana Vault, which was also unrestricted at the time, a 1 mana artifact that you can, as a one-time thing, can tap it to make 3. So it puts you 2 mana ahead of where you currently are. So 4 Mana Vaults, 4 Mind Twists, 4 Libraries. The rest doesn't even really matter. So many of the games you would just hand destroy your opponent utterly on the first, like turn 1 or turn 2. You would take almost all the cards out of their hand. Meanwhile, you'd be drawing 2 or 3 cards a turn because you could play multiple libraries. And you would bury the opponent almost immediately in this avalanche of card advantage and discard. And so we put this deck together, and it was so overwhelmingly insane. None of the people in our play group in Santa Cruz wanted to play against it. Matt, and all the test games that Matt and I played against, nothing could even touch it. It was absolutely invincible. And lacking a particular way to describe what it was doing, we had made the direct damage deck, the protection deck, the land destruction deck, and we just said, let's just call this thing the deck, because that's what it is. It's just the deck. This deck is just, it beats everything, and there's no real superlative to describe it. And about 2 or 3 weeks later, Manifest happened. Matt actually went, because between us, we didn't have 8 Libraries of Alexandria and 8 Mind Twists. We only had like 5 and 6. we decided that one of us would take the deck to this event to represent our brain trust. And we rolled a 20-sided die to see who would go, and Matt won the die roll. So he went to Manifest and, as expected, destroyed everyone in the entire event. Undefeated through the entire event. Like, I don't know how many rounds, because it was a gigantic event, 12 or 13 rounds. Destroyed every single person quite effortlessly and won the event, which was a big deal. But then a really big turning point happened shortly afterward. Matt decided that he wanted to leave UC Santa Cruz because he had an opportunity to go work in the pretty much brand new internet service provider industry, which was springing up in the Bay Area. And he's a really technically savvy guy, and he was offered a really, really good position at a brand new startup, an ISP, I think called Netcom at the time. And so he dropped out of Santa Cruz and went to go work at Netcom, and he left me to my own devices. And right afterward, in the summer of 1994, both Library of Alexandria and MindTwist got restricted. So the deck, as it stood, the version that Matt and I had built together, was now obsolete. And I was left basically in a position where I wanted to try to recreate that dominance, to kind of recreate that overwhelming effect. And so I started looking around among the other cards that were available at the time for things that could actually replicate that effect. And I touched on the two cards, Disrupting Scepter and JM Tome, which nobody had used up to that point, really, and decided that those two cards would kind of form the backbone of my strategy. And I had been fine-tuning it as well, removing creatures and doing a bunch of things. And singularly, on my own, over the span of the next 2.5 months, 3 months, developed what really became the deck as it propagated virally through the entire Magic world. Shortly after an event called, I think it was called Dundracon? Yeah, I believe it was called Dundracon, which took place a little bit after the summer. It was right after the Dart came out. It was like a couple of weeks after the Dart came out. But I took the deck in its version to Dundracon and won the event. And nobody had seen, and it was a huge event, 512 entrants or something, 2 days of 256 person, I think it was single Elam. It was nuts. I don't even think it was Swiss. But anyway, steamrolled through the whole event, and there were 2 Wizards of the Coast representatives at that event to sort of oversee it, because it was one of the biggest Magic events that had ever happened. And after I won it, they came over and wanted to talk to me about the deck that I was using. And they could not believe that it only had 2 Sarah Angels as its win conditions and a Brain Geyser. They just were utterly astonished. Nobody had ever seen a deck like that was that consistent, that could win over and over and over again in such a deterministic fashion with only 2 real ways to win the game. And so they interviewed me about it, and shortly afterward, the first mentions of the deck began to go viral on the Usenet at the time. It started to become a subject of discussions. I had a really good friend of mine who you may know, you may remember his name. Do you remember Paul Pantera?
Name sounds familiar.
He was sort of like the first, because Paul Pantera worked for Sun Microsystems, and he was connected to the internet in the early days. You know, he was really big and active on the Usenet, and he also had one of the first websites that sold Magic cards, a place called collectmart.com, which mattered a few years later when I actually worked for them for about a year. But anyway, Paul was sort of the original evangelist for Bay Area Magic on the internet. So he went online, and his posts, I've read them recently, actually, they're atrocious. They're so arrogant. It's unbelievably, and like not even a shred of humility. This is like, bow down, motherfuckers. Like, we have solved Magic in the Bay Area, and none of you are worthy. None of you understand the game. You're all peons and morons. We've totally solved this game. This is the best deck in the world. Nothing beats it. And if you're not playing this, you're a moron. That's kind of what he was saying in his Usenet posts, essentially. So obviously it was very controversial, but of course people, the natural impulse when they hear that is, oh yeah, well, I'm going to challenge you then, right? Build your deck and show you how you're wrong. And of course, once everyone constructs this thing, they realize, Jesus Christ, this really is true. It just beats everything. Because at the time, what the deck fundamentally did was just so advanced compared to where everybody else was in terms of their fundamental understanding of Magic, that nothing really could objectively compete with it, and couldn't for many years, actually. In fact, I'd say that it wasn't until Ice Age came along that there really was a kind of viable way to play Magic besides Control in what at the time was called Type 1. But and then different pockets of players the country and the world developed their own spins on this concept, and that's where Keeper came along. So the New England guys presumably saw this deck list and thought that it could be accomplished in a different way. They probably said, well, why use creatures at all? Because their deck had no creatures. the reason why it was called keepers, because they would kill you with millstone.
Millstone, yeah, I figured. Yeah.
And they had a card called Elemental Augury, which was printed in Ice Age, and with Elemental Augury, you could
deny.
You look at the top 3 cards of either library, and you can reorder them. So with Augury and Millstone, you can pretty much guarantee your opponent draws nothing but mana for the rest of the game. Okay. So that's why it would keep you in that position indefinitely while you kind of just watch your deck get ground to nothing. So,
I'm West Coast. I support you. This is even before I entered the story. So keep going. This is awesome.
Yeah. So anyway, and then it had to have been 1995. One of the very first Magic-related websites, the Magic Dojo, came along.
I remember. Yeah.
For its day, the Magic Dojo was the source of everything related to Magic. There was no place on Earth where there was more kind of consolidation of theory, strategy, deck construction, tournament reports, card analysis, kind of everything related to the game was all consolidated on that website. And there was a guy named Rob Hahn, who I think he was just an undergrad. He might have been a graduate student out back east. And I don't remember where Rob Hahn came from. Really, really nice guy. And he put together this sort of transformational essay that he called The Schools of Magic, which you probably read. And he summarily edited it and revised it in the subsequent years. But the Schools of Magic article basically tried to outline the kind of fundamental, almost like martial arts, is what his analogy was like. But he had basically there were 3 or 4, it might have been like 4 or 5 pillars of Magic that kind of, these decks sort of encapsulate specific ideas that are more deep and fundamental underlying archetypes in Magic. So he had like a deck that was demonstrative of sort of the weenie aggro concept. He had the land destruction deck. He had the put out big creatures and disrupt their hand version deck. And then of course he had the consummate control deck personified in the deck itself. And he had names ascribed to each one of these deck types as well. So there was the Handelman deck, the Masonette deck. This predated the famous Sly deck, of course, which was kind of the really big viral, the original aggro deck, certainly red-based aggro deck. And then, of course, there was the deck which was associated with my name. So it was the Rob Hahn's article, Paul Pantera's advocacy, and the kind of confluence of all those things that really thrust my name, the sort of Weissman name, and attached to this deck, to the forefront of Magic's propagation on the early internet around the whole world. So my name was always sort of inextricably linked to that, and people always sort of associated my name with this archetype, going all the way into the present.
I was more of a dilettante during that time, so I would hear word of mouth. So like when I went to Superstars, like John Sasso would mention it, like Ilya Balin, Jeff Simino, and I'm recently in contact with Roger Ver, so shout out to him. He's
I guess you mentioned that you were talking about Roger in a podcast from a couple of days ago.
Yeah, we're gonna do one of it anyway. So I heard
Roger.
from he made a pro tour, man. He made a pro tour, but I heard about you through them, not like the dojo. And I think by the time I saw the dojo, it was already reasonably developed. And I did see your name there, but I think I had already met you before I even saw your name on there.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we overlapped like crazy, right? I mean, we were playing in the same place because I was at UC Santa Cruz through, I want to say like mid 1995. And then I took a leave of absence because Magic was just consuming all my time and it was just incompatible with continuing to go to school. And then I lived in the Bay Area. I was actually living in Cupertino, and I was living with my friend Matt Wallace, the guy who went to work for Netcom. He and I were roommates, but he wasn't playing Magic anymore at all. He barely even had a collection. He had completely left the game behind and did not care about it. But I was playing full time. Yeah, do you remember, what was the place called?
Umatilla, Way St. Sweet. Yes, Wrinkle in Time. I never went there, but I heard about it. But there was also a place to play.
And of course, a place. Yeah, who could forget a place to play, right? That was
I was in Palo Alto, so I didn't go to the San Jose location that often. But I went to Match Play, which became Neutral Grounds.
Yeah, well, and that was the place in Mountain View.
Yeah.
That place that was at the San Antonio Shopping Center, which really kind of became the nexus of Magic once places like a place to play in Wrinkle in Time closed down, which was a few years later.
So I don't remember the articles so much. I mean, I know I've read articles that you've written and, the dojo stuff, but really it's just like interactions with you the very first time I got wrecked by that version of the deck. And then that's what, really burst my thinking process in a scope of like, I'm sure months. I just got to, a lot better. I don't really know or care where I stood, but it was like, I started entering the Pro Tour qualifiers and doing much better after, interacting with you.
Yeah, well, Magic, it's interesting because one of the things that I always advocate for, and when people ask me how to get better at Magic in general, one of the things that I really advocate for, I actually have a YouTube channel that I've been curating now for, like 7 years.
Well, we'll link to it.
Yeah. I mean, it has low subscriber count. It's like a little over 2,000. I've never ever worked to promote it in any way. I've had it promoted because of podcasts and interviews and stuff I've done over the years, but I've never really gone out of my way. And I certainly don't produce, I have certainly not earned a big subscriber base because I barely produce any content for it. But it consists entirely of almost entirely, 99% or more of 1v1 games of the format called Commander, played online on Magic Online, replete with commentary. So basically I'll have a session where I play Magic Online for a couple of hours, playing just random games with usually a mixture of decks or one specific deck against random opponents. And occasionally one of those games will be quite interesting for one reason or another, usually because my opponent gets a very fast start. They draw a bunch of early fast mana and I'm really far behind. And it's a tough game that I have to make a lot of very careful decisions and then hopefully can turn the game around and figure out a way to win when woefully behind. And when that happens, what I'll do is I go back, and unfortunately, Magic the Gathering Online is so poorly programmed and such a dinosaur that it has tons of endemic bugs. One of the worst bugs, particularly for content creators, is that when you play a game of Magic Online, the program saves an archive of that game on your hard drive, but the saving process is imperfect, to the point where what will often happen is that a particular card you may draw a card, or your opponent might draw a card, and for some reason there's it's almost like a DNA transcription error. The code of the card that's associated in the internal database with what that card is supposed to be will get screwed up by a digit or a letter. And so you'll draw a card in the game that you never drew. You'll draw a mana drain, what was a mana drain, but it gets, instead of being, A1C2, it's A1C3, which is like a 6 mana creature. So you'll see in the game, like you draw a 6 mana creature. Later on in the game, when you try to play the mana drain, of course, the replay tries to have you play a mana drain, but it's a 6 mana creature. It doesn't know what to do, and the replay gets stuck permanently. So it's been very frustrating doing this process for years, because I'll have some amazing game and I'm like, this is amazing. I can't wait to go and publish this. And I'll start going through the game, and 6 turns in, I draw a card that I never drew, and then the replay is hopelessly broken. So despite that, I've still managed to post around 400 videos or so. And the whole purpose of that channel, and this relates to what I was saying before about how people approach me through email all the time with questions, or on YouTube comments and stuff about ways to improve. The primary thrust of the channel is entertainment, obviously, is a component of it, but I really go out of my way to try to educate. I'm really trying to use it as a teaching tool as well, because it can often be the best way to teach someone about how to think strategically and think ahead in the game, and thinking of the range of all the things your opponent can do, and really being very goal-oriented with regards to how you play a game of Magic too, which is something that I think a lot of people don't really consider. They're working towards the sort of more superficial goals that exist in a game of Magic. Like, I'm going to try to preserve my life, so I'm going to try to kill the opponent. But there's so many other larger goals that are going on within that framework that you really should be focusing on. And when you're focused on those goals, the other stuff just sort of happens automatically by extension of doing the right things. This is sort of like the fundamental strategy of why the deck works. Because
I'll be a testament to this, because like that's each of the sessions that we played together back in the day, you would like tell me something, and it must be like, some god telling some peon, because like I remember how bad I was, so it must have been like really frustrating for you, but you were trying to like communicate information. And then at some point I got like, relatively, competent, but it's just a testament.
Yeah, you're a super smart person, and you're also a great gamer. So a lot of that stuff would sort of just naturally click in your head quite quickly. And I've revised and changed my teaching. I'm sure that back when, you met me when I was in my early 20s, I was a great deal less patient and
yes, but at the same time, it was very obvious that you meant well. And I recount these stories like I was in a Type 1 tournament, and I like when I mention people, like, you know, say you, like people think I'm like name dropping, but I'm more of just like tributing, like that you had a big impact on my development.
Well, there's a difference between an homage and and simply just sort of cynically using someone's name in an effort to promote yourself, right? They're very different things, and I totally get that, and I certainly appreciate the advocacy. And I've run into plenty of people over the years who have said sort of similar things. You remember Chris Cade, I imagine.
Yes, I remember Chris Cade.
I bumped into Chris Cade, out of the blue at Grand Prix or Magic Fest Las Vegas last year in August. It was literally seconds after I had just won the old school event there, the old school championship. And
I saw that on Twitter. Yeah.
Yeah, that was. It turned into a horrible debacle, but for about an hour, it was really great. And in that hour, Chris came up to me, and I hadn't seen him in forever. This guy walks up, you know, he's got a receding hairline, and he looks like he's in his 40s, but he's familiar. And I said, "Oh my God, is that Chris Cade? I can't believe it." And I gave him a big hug, and he was there with his son. And one of the first things he did was he told his son, he said, "This is, you know, Brian Weissman, who was instrumental in really framing my fundamental understanding of Magic and really teaching me how to play it at a deep level," which was obviously very flattering to hear. And I've heard similar things over the years from people. Obviously, I was a competitor foremost, and so because I was a competitor, it was kind of incumbent on me to try to balance teaching and advocacy for the game with also trying to kind of still keep a bit of an advantage. But I think I've learned something about myself over the years that I really do enjoy teaching. I really love it, particularly obviously in the context of Magic of things I understand well. But for example, on Saturday, I'm hosting for the first time a clinic for the sport disc golf, which is something I've been playing avidly for about 15 years. I didn't play it particularly well, I think, until more recently, but I've really, really come to understand a lot of deep and fundamental things about biomechanics and human physiology in terms of how it relates to throwing a golf disc well, and really have felt like I've given impromptu lessons to dozens of people over the last few months and felt like it was time to actually do something formal. And I really, really enjoy the process of teaching. So I think that even though I had this sort of deeply habituated behavior of wanting to kind of keep my secrets to myself in order to profit from them, literally monetarily, because if you remember back in the day, we played for Ante and stuff, and
I wasn't involved in that, but
yeah, well, money drafts came later. Ante gave way to money drafts, but people always felt the compulsion, like we want to put some stakes on the outcome of the game. Originally it was ante, and it wasn't ante in the conventional sense. It wasn't ante like we randomly cut each other's decks and that's the ante. That's the wager.
I remember. Yeah, this is definitely after I met you, but I think it was just about the transition. You guys would play for cards, right?
That's exactly right. You'd have a trade binder, and you'd also have an ante binder. They were often the same thing for a lot of people, but your ante binder, you would basically present it to your opponent, and you would look through and you'd go, okay, well, I'd like to play for your Beta Tundra. And your opponent would go through your binder, and they'd go, I know, let's play for this revised fork, which was literally an ante that I contested against a guy from Southern California, a guy named Les Douglas. Beta Tundra his Beta Tundra versus my revised fork. We ran that several times, and I won every game. And I actually still have those Beta Tundras, which is amazing. But anyway, even though obviously it was advantageous to harbor secrets, I still found that I really enjoyed kind of expressing my vision for the game and really explaining to people everything that I had learned about it. So I shared that in conversations like with people like you, also through articles, some interviews and stuff. But I mean, obviously the conduits to spread this information were very limited at the time. I didn't really start writing any articles for the internet for a while. I kind of let other people do that for me. And then gradually enough people approached me, I started doing some commentary and so on threads that people had started. And then there were a few articles, like I wrote an article for The Duelist. That's the Duelist magazine was...
I barely read that thing, so...
Yeah, I think they made about 25-ish, this is just a guess, but maybe 20 to 25 issues of that magazine that they physically published in paper form. And then gradually it just moved online. It was The Duelist online for a while. But there was an article that I wrote for that. It was... I think it may have just been called The Deck, or maybe it had the word, I think it was called Taking Card Advantage. It just jumped into my head. Let me Google that real quick. See if you can actually find it. Taking card advantage.
Yeah, so like the personal lessons basically, or the personal advice. I think you were just trying to teach everybody, and I, just took it in. But like, I definitely got a lot. So basically, I didn't need to read the articles because they were all in your verbal lessons. You also, one thing that doesn't necessarily do you justice with these articles is you would teach me about physical tells for Magic as well. So I don't know how much you want to reveal, but
oh, I'm happy to talk about it. I mean, I've talked about it extensively in some videos that I've done more recently. A good friend of mine, his name is Daniel Chiang, and he runs a company called VintageMagic.com, which is really one of the foremost purveyors of high-end cards for the old school format. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I think like at least the way you viewed me was definitely more of like mentor student, like not as competitive probably as you had. But one of the things is, and maybe you were through with competitions. I don't remember the exact era, and this is definitely
still very competitive.
Oh no, I mean like we're trying to win, but like I think at least what I felt the way you were teaching me was like you genuinely wanted me to get better, to like move on to things. I guess I don't know if it's so universal.
No, I think so. I honestly think that with really anybody that I never entered into a conversation with somebody where I had some sort of overt strategy of deceiving them, of telling them things that were not correct. If I was going to have a conversation with you about Magic, I'm going to lay it on the line. I'm not going to mince words, and I'm certainly not going to obfuscate what I know, because again, I have this overriding instinct to want to teach people. I mean, this relates to sort of everything, all of the communication I do in my life, not even necessarily in the confines of Magic, but I'm sort of such an intrinsically evidence-based person that I always sort of try to, anything that I say, I want to be able to provide evidence for that, for my points of view and for positions that I take. And obviously in the context of Magic, if I'm going to tell you something, well, I'm certainly going to have concrete evidence to back that up. Like I can literally show you in a game right now why I'm doing this.
It paid off because what happened was you noticed a tell of mine, which is like if I had an answer to something, I would like immediately shift that card to like the left side or something like that. That came into play because when we were in a Pro Tour qualifier with the teams with Hui Saint Shui, I noticed my opponent was an extrovert and he would constantly be watching for stuff. And a lot of the stuff that you taught me like years ago when I was actually like more trying, I corrected those throughout the years. So when I noticed he was like looking for stuff, I was able to manipulate the situation. And I know you commented, like I had a game where I think you might have thought my play was questionable. I had explosive growth with kicker. So I played it accordingly, in which I think at the time you thought might have been questionable, but what I didn't tell you was that my opponent was an extrovert and he was watching my hand motions.
Okay.
So I did something to pretend that I didn't have the card. So when I did it, and then he did a bad block, in which I think you were surprised, because I know you were sweating me that game. You were surprised he did a certain block, and then I got him like really bad with that. But so that was something that I never credited you for something you taught me like years ago, and then I executed.
I mean, it certainly sounds like you sort of engineered that situation on your own. Perhaps you're giving me credit for it, but I mean, that's an awesome story. And I love that. That's obviously something that's really... You
gave me a really hard time, but I remember I said I'll tell you later, but I never did.
You never did?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's always, whenever you're playing on a team, right, and it's down to one guy's match, and the outcome of your team effort is contingent on whether your opponent does play perfectly, or I'm sorry, not your opponent, but your teammate plays perfectly. And it's very easy to be hypercritical of their decisions, particularly because you're not inside their head. So yeah, of course, I mean, I'll admit to certainly watching both you and Yuban play and being like, what the fuck is happening here? Like, obviously these guys are nuts, but the results do speak for themselves to an extent. That was quite a team, wasn't it? I just was thinking about that this afternoon.
We made the Pro Tour and I punted, like, because, and it's not really an excuse, but it is a rationale. Magic's like, I mean, I'm Command and Conquer first, then Warcraft, then Starcraft. Magic's probably like my fourth game
fourth
or fifth game. So like to me, it's like a kid in a candy store. Like, I just want to learn. I'm not real. I want to win, but I'm not like, oh, this, means this is like, my identity. It's like something I'm very, very interested in. So
my quick Mike Long story, which people may appreciate. So this is the stage of this story. Long and I are playing at Pro Tour LA number 2, I think. 2 or 3. It's not terribly important. What it is it was one of the very last events where they did a Rochester draft for at the tables. Did you ever draft Rochester? You must have.
I drafted with you, and I remember you not being happy with the format because it's so slow.
Yeah, it is slow. I mean, there's a lot more information. It tests very, very different skills, particularly because signaling and diplomacy is such a big part. For the audience, people who are not familiar with Rochester, because it's been long gone. It was retired as a draft format ages ago, at least in Wizards events. But booster draft, you open up a pack of 15, nobody else sees it, you take one card, you pass the booster to your left side. And that goes around the table until all the packs are drafted. Then you go to the right with a pack, and then to the left with a pack until everybody has 45 picks. In Rochester drafts, a pack is open and presented face up on the table. So 15 cards are face up on the table. One person is designated to go first. They pick one card that's face up. The draft proceeds to the left until it gets to the 8th person, who picks 2 cards. They're the bounce point. They pick 2, and then it circles back the other way to the person to the original drafter's left, at which point the last card is picked, and the original drafter only gets 1 card. Everybody else gets 2. So in Rochester draft, it's very interesting because you have complete information. You get to see what everybody is picking, and you can adjust your strategy accordingly. So if the guy to your right picks up a very powerful blue card early that has 2 blue in the casting cost, it's a pretty good signal to you to avoid blue, because he just took a big blue rare. And now you know that I don't want to take blue, even if the second best card in the pack is also a blue card. It's more advantageous for me in the long term to take a black card that's decent, because that way I'm not competing with my neighbor for blue.
Right.
So there's lots of information in Rochester, which makes it a very fascinating format. It was also often structured, at least in top 8s, that you would know who your first round opponent was as well. You would know that.
Right, you're crossed over, yeah.
Right, it determined where the seating was. You'd be sitting across from the guy that you would play, so you could see his entire deck as you played, and you could literally draft cards directly against your first round opponent, essentially to hedge to win your first match, because the dollar amounts jumped so much between top 8 and top 4. It was like a more than double increase in value. So anyway, I'm drafting at a table, Rochester draft, with Mike Long and six other people, including Igor Freeman, Michael Lecanto, who was the first Pro Tour champion. I don't know if there are any other name players, but this is big stress. The winner of this table is guaranteed top 8. If you go 3-0, you're guaranteed top 8. If you go 2-0-1, you're probably top 8. If you go 2-1, maybe on tiebreakers. But if you win the table, you're in. So in the we sit down, first round of pairings get out, and I drafted what I feel is a very strong deck, and it's right along the archetype that I've been drafting the whole event: a blue-white-green defensive fortress with banders and flyers.
What were the sets?
Mirage Visions, Rochester draft. So it was just 2 sets, Mirage and Visions. There was no Weatherlight in there yet. Weatherlight came later, so it was just those 2 sets. And the deck that my team had developed to draft in that format, that seemed like it was the most accessible, that you could consistently get it, and that it worked well. Because the best deck was probably like something like blue-black with lots of bounce, like Mana War and Undo and flyers and flankers and stuff. But that deck was very competitive. It was very hard to get the pieces to it consistently because they were all first picks. Whereas the blue-white-green deck had a lot of kind of innocuous pieces that all worked really well together. So cards like Jolt and Ivory Charm and stuff, these kind of garbagey 12th to 13th, 14th picks, were all stars in this deck. They worked really, really well in it. So we drafted the strategy because we knew that we could consistently get it, and it worked great. I mean, I cruised through the Swiss rounds drafting these decks. And so the deck I've drafted is totally in line with that archetype, feels very, very good. In the first round, I get paired up against Michael Lecanto, this very kind of brash, loudmouth, honestly, objectively kind of an asshole, this guy from New England who was the first Pro Tour winner, who has a major chip on his shoulder because after winning the first pro event, he's done very poorly in all subsequent events, which has made everybody really question his ability at the game. I think it's just a fluke. So he's got something to prove. We start to play, and we're midway through the first game when I think Mark Rosewater, or one of the judges, runs over and says, guys, stop. We screwed up the pairings. You're not actually playing. At which point Michael Aconto jumps up out of his seat furiously and he slams 2 copies of Crash of Rhinos on the table. Crash of Rhinos is...
I know, the 8/4 trample, yeah.
8 mana, 8/4 trample, like total garbage by any modern context. Yeah. And pretty garbage in that format too, but at least like the kind of thing, because of banding, it was the kind of thing you might actually put in the deck. Because if you band it to another creature, you can attack with this much larger thing where 8 of the damage is trample and you can get through. Anyway, Michael Aconto jumps up and enraged, he slams his 2 Crash of Rhinos on the table and he goes, "Your ass was kicked. Your ass was kicked." That's what he says to me. And I'm like, okay, well, that's nice. Great. Well, I'm glad we didn't have to play that game out then. So I pick up my cards and now I'm paired up against Mike Long. And Long actually, unlike Michael Aconto, because I got to see Michael Aconto draft his deck where he very sadly took Crash of Rhinos multiple times because it sucks. I'm playing against Long. Long's deck is genuinely good. It's scary. I think his deck is blue-black. And he has, among other things, he has a Necrotal in his deck, which is very, very powerful creature in the format, and multiple ways to return the Necrotal to his hand via Manowar, Shrieking Drake. I think he has an Undo in his deck. He has multiple flyers, black flankers. It's like a really good blue-black deck, and I'm very scared of playing him. So we play our first game, and it's a long, grinding attrition fest. It goes really, really long, and I finally beat him in the late game using my big banding, trampling guys. And I get through and I kill him. Game 2, he gets an early Necrotal, and he bounces it multiple times and just destroys me. A total blowout. I lose quite quickly. We go to game 3, and we're kind of running out of time. And at this point, most of the tournament site is cleared out now. There's, at least most of the tables are empty, which means that we have a huge audience. We have like 50 people crowded around our table, everybody. And Long is there, and this is a really close game. It's really undecided. He does get his Necrotal early, but I'm able to kill it or deal with it somehow. I think I had one removal spell in my deck, which was a green sorcery called Nyaro Bee Sting, which is
2 damage for 4. I know.
He plays his Necrotal, and before he's able to start bouncing it, I kill it with Nyaro Bee Sting, which I've been saving specifically for that card because I knew it was one of the ways I could lose. Anyway, I have this artifact in play called Magma Mine.
I know it. Yeah.
Remember it?
Yeah.
Magma Mine is, I'm going to look it up real quick because there's one important component to this story. It's about when you can sacrifice it, whether you can sacrifice it during upkeep or whether you can sacrifice it at any time.
I don't know. I think it's upkeep.
Yeah, I'm double checking just to make sure because it's important for continuity here. Let's load. Come on.
You mentioned me those sets too.
Yeah, I mean
when Weatherlight came out. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean this is back when I can sacrifice it. Okay, so you can sacrifice it at any time for what looks like, yeah, it's just tap and sack. Okay. However, so it's 1 mana, tap and sacrifice Magma Mine to deal damage to any target equal to the number of pressure counters on the Magma Mine. But adding a pressure counter to Magma Mine costs 4 mana. And like any person who's played Magic in the last 15, 20 years would look at Magma Mine and be like, that card is hot garbage. Yeah, it's absolute trash. You would never even consider it. But in that time, in that era, in 1996, in the decks that we were drafting, it was an all-star. It was a total sleeper, along with this card called Telemtor's Darts, which other people would just totally dismiss. It's like 3 mana to cast, 2 and tap, deal a damage.
1 damage to player, yeah.
Horrible, right? But in that, you're just doing nothing but gumming up the ground and surviving and pinging them 20 times with the Telemtor's Darts. It was good. So it's Magma Mine, right? You could pay 4 mana every turn to keep pumping in and pumping in and pumping in and pumping in. Eventually, it's lethal.
Yeah.
So we're in this game, and I've got Magma Mine in play. He's blue-black, so he should have no way to deal with it, right? There's outside of like, maybe there's 1 or 2 blue cards that might bounce, but I haven't seen any, and I don't think he drafted any.
Boomerang was in the set, I believe. But
what's that?
I think Boomerang was in Mirage.
Yeah, I think so. But I don't think he had a Boomerang in his deck. Maybe he did. Anyway, I've got Magma Mine in play, and I'm dutifully pumping mana into it every turn. And initially, I only have enough mana to pump it once per turn. But we're in this stalemate, and eventually I got 8 mana, so now it's going up twice. Meanwhile, Long has managed to kill more of my creatures and now has a flyer that's hitting me undeterred. So I'm taking damage every turn. I have the ground locked up. The only thing that's holding me and keeping me in the game is this Magma Mine that's steadily ticking up. And now it's at 10, and now it's at 11, and 12, and 13. Now I've got 8 mana in play, so I can do it twice a turn. And Long adds another flyer to the mix. Now he's hitting me for 4 a turn, and we're going back and forth. But of course, he knows the math, and he understands that I'm gonna win the race. because the magma mine is too big and he's at 16 or something, and he's not going to be able to outrun it even with his flyers. So he goes into full Mike Long, throw my opponent off his game mode. And for Mike Long, that means, I'm going to put my microphone over here so I don't knock it off the table. That means sitting in his chair like this, way up in his chair, and he's bouncing around like a, and he's like hopping up and down, chattering at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and he's reaching over and he's checking my graveyard, and he's interacting with the audience. He's just doing every possible thing he can to get in my head, and it's working. It's totally working. I'm getting like, my heart is pounding because this is top 8 on the line. This will be the second time that I'll have made a top 8, the first time in a limited event. I really, really want to win. Like, I really want to make a top 8. Obviously the money means the world to me because I don't have any money. And I got to get past Mike Long, who's one of the toughest players you could possibly not hope to face in a Magic event. And he's fucking rattling me. And like, my heart is pounding, and I'm being super, super deliberate and systematic with everything I do. And I'm already a very deliberate player anyway, but I'm being extra careful that I don't miss a goddamn thing. Because if I miss one activation of my magma mine at any point, I'm going to die to the flyers. The math doesn't work out, but it still works out in my favor. So we get down to the penultimate turn, and Long hits me with the creatures, and I drop down to 3 or something. And I have 9 mana in play or something, and I got magma mine in play, and it's at 12 counters, and he's at 16. And so I go, okay, you're done. Like, I make sure he's done. Okay, Mike, at the end of your turn, I tap 8 mana, and I pump the magma mine up to 14. And he goes, okay. I'm like, okay, he doesn't have a boomerang. I untap. Okay, during my upkeep, before anything else happens, pay 8 mana, pump up magma mine once, twice, it's at 16. We both acknowledge that. And like, the crowd is just pressing in, you know, my heart is thudding. I'm like, this has to work. This is the game. This gets me into, you know, the next round, and I think I can win out. And I go, okay, I sacrifice my magma mine and I deal 16 to you. And Long, without missing a beat, still bouncing up, reaches into his hand, and he throws a card face down on the table, and he goes, I rust it.
What?
Because I cast rust.
Oh. It's not in the set.
And I go, oh my God. And I put my head down on the table, like, just like, he had rust. I can't believe it. How on earth could he have rust? It's just so insane that he would have that card. Why would he be playing with that card? And I'm going through I literally see this green card on the table, that it's rust. And the crowd just gasps. And this moment just hangs in time for about 7-8 seconds. And then Long cackles loudly and scoops up his cards and concedes. Because rust is
doesn't on the set. Yeah.
Legends, that's green.
Yeah.
It's it's not even in the card pool or anything. And it's green. He couldn't possibly have it, right?
Yeah.
And yet he was so inside my head that, you know, had the situation been sort of had less gravity to it, it's entirely possible that I would have been like, fuck, he got me. Concede then, I guess. I die to the flyers. Because I just spent all my mana in my upkeep to pump the magma mine.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I mean, it's still that story still gives me PTSD to an extent because of what was on the line. But it does say something not only just about his skill in terms of getting in someone's head, but it speaks to kind of things that I'm sure that he did, because obviously Long has a reputation for bending the rules in his favor in many ways. He was caught famously at U.S. Nationals with a critical card in a combo deck that he was playing under his leg in his lap that fell on the ground.
Prosperous Bloom, anyway. Yes,
the famous Prosperous Bloom incident. Whether or not he was cheating in that situation, I don't feel like there was enough evidence really to say either way. It certainly is very suspicious. It could be something that's entirely innocent. I think that if I were playing that deck and I wanted access to one card at all times, it wouldn't be Prosperous Bloom. It would probably be the Squandered Resources that was the other part of the combo. But anyway, he had a unique skill to get into people's minds in a way that nobody else could. And I'm sure that in a similar situation, if he's playing, like, let's say a casual game against somebody, or a game just in an early Swiss round off in the corner, and he has no other choice, then his opponent goes, okay, I'm going to deal lethal to you. And Long just throws a red card on the table and goes, bolt you. And the guy goes, oh shit, damn it. And he picks up his cards and concedes. Like, the way that the rules were back then, that you were not punished for doing that. There was actually no official rebuke. There was nothing in the rules that addressed doing something like that. And even if you did get caught by a judge, the worst thing you would do is just get a warning. They would just say, oh, please don't do that again. Nowadays, you're like instant game loss or match loss or worse, right? If you misrepresent a card. But 1996 Magic was the Wild West, and Mike Long was the sheriff, for sure. He was someone you did not want to face. I had a great record against him though. Whenever he and I played, we played I think 3 times in the Pro Tour. We played at Pro Tour Paris, where he played Prosperous Bloom. We played in that event, and we also played in the Type 1 event too, the one in Dallas, and I was 2-1 against him. So winning record against Mike Long in pro competition at least.
That Pro Tour, I punted, and I remember you weren't very mad because we were kind of like, I think you were probably like 30, I was like mid-20s, and just like, we're kind of over it. We're happy to be there, and of course I feel bad for punting, but like, we had such a crappy card pool.
I do remember that. I mean, it was such an interesting, the entire experience is really interesting, not just because of the tournament, but also because of the historical framing around that event, which is a crazy story in its own right. I don't know how much you remember. Do you remember when that tournament was?
It has to be 2000.
I was shocked if you didn't remember the exact date of it. That's a hint.
Oh, was it right around 9/11?
It was the weekend before.
Oh my God.
It was literally the weekend before. The tournament, the 9/11 attacks happened on Tuesday morning, September 11th, 2001.
Wow.
We played on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday on September, whatever that is, 7th, 8th, and 9th of that year in New York City at Madison Square Garden. That's where the tournament was. It was in New York City the weekend before the biggest terrorist attack in U.S. history in New York.
Wow. Yeah, it's coming back to me now, yeah.
Yeah, on Monday, I flew out. I was scheduled to fly out of New York City on Monday night. And I spent Monday afternoon touring the city, taking pictures of the World Trade Center from the deck of the Empire State Building. It's in the background, like less than 24 hours away from being destroyed. And the craziest thing too is that I was scheduled to fly, I think around 9 p.m. on Monday night, going from New York City out of, I think it was LaGuardia Airport, because there's 3. There's Newark and LaGuardia. And 2 of the 3 airports had hijacked planes that left from them. I think that LaGuardia and JFK had hijacked planes, and Newark was not affected. And I believe that I was flying out of the airport that did not have hijackers in it. But on Monday night, when I was due to fly out, I left Manhattan in a taxi and drove, I remember, across the Brooklyn Bridge. And as we were driving, this gigantic torrential thunderstorm blew in. A really, really intense thunderstorm came in, early fall, late summer thunderstorm, blanketed the city in lightning and thunder and wind, and obviously deluged the airport. And we're sitting around in the airport and getting closer and closer and closer to the time to leave. And it's very apparent that the flight is not going to take off in a thunderstorm. So they delayed the flight for an hour. They delayed the flight for another hour. It's now like 10:30 at night. Flight still hasn't left. This is Monday night on September 10th, 2001. They come over the loudspeaker and they finally announce that the flight has been canceled and it's going to be moved to the following morning. And so they ask everybody who's on the flight to go up to the little desk to check in to see about accommodations and possibly to get rescheduled to fly out of a different airport the following morning. And one of the flights that they were recommending that we take the following morning was out of JFK, a flight from New York to California out of JFK, which is literally what one of the hijacked planes was, the following morning on September 11th. And I remember going over to the payphone and calling my girlfriend's brother, who we were staying with at the time, and saying, we need to come back. We're going to spend the night in Manhattan and go back tomorrow morning to fly out. And while I was on the phone, I noticed a bunch of people kind of rush back to the desk. And so I put the phone down and went over, and they said that, well, the storm has cleared temporarily. There's a big hole in the clouds, and we're going to let some flights out, including yours, so you guys can leave. So we flew out. We left at about midnight on the morning of September 11th, like at 12:30 in the morning, and landed in California at 5 o'clock in the morning or something, and got back, and within a couple of hours got phone calls from people that were panicking about the fact that we had just flown back from New York to California. Yeah, so we were incredibly. I mean, obviously the flight might have been different. There's no way to really know in retrospect, but as far as getting extremely close to that Calamity without actually being in it. We got damn close, but that was the last Pro Tour that I played in. It was that team event with you two guys. And we got a bad card pool. I feel like we weren't prepared though. Like we just didn't practice at all.
No, we were all busy. Like, you know, I don't remember what you were doing. I know you were hardcore busy. Hui had a job. I remember the event and I know what intense things were going on through my life. So I spent a lot of like when these team events, and I qualify with Hui St. Shui and Steve Aldrich, rest in peace Steve Aldrich, the year after.
Remember that.
And like I'm the one who kind of dilettante prepares, and then I kind of give you guys intel what I think, and then I think you guys are more solid and veterans and more into the game. So then you kind of like set the tone. I think when we were getting our card pool, you were the one basically distributing.
Building the decks. I remember. I definitely remember that at the qualifier. That I kind of went through everything, and you guys kind of just deferred to me, and that's probably honestly almost the best way to do it.
Yeah.
Because if you don't do it that way, I don't even know if team events are a thing anymore. But if you ever play in a team event, it's way better to just sort of delegate that responsibility to one person, because otherwise you get this problem where you have two people, like two of the other guys are vying for like, no, I really want that in my deck. Like, give that to me, because they want to be winning more. But that's not the objective. You need to make 3 strong decks that are a 7 out of 10 rather than 1 10, 1 9, and 1 4.
So a testament to you too is like, it's not like you hoard all the good cards. You really do try to allocate like the best chances to win. And I probably have the most like street personality out of all 3. So I could play anything, but you know, aggro decks, like I'll try to figure something out because I'm more experienced with those. So I think you knew like what to. I don't remember the exact cards, but you did some micromanaged choices where you're like, you know, this would be good for Wayne's deck, and then they actually did come up. I don't remember what. One of the cards was Repulse. Like you were playing blue-white, you obviously Repulse is an amazing card. It would be great for you. And then I was playing 5-color green, and you forced me to splash for Repulse, and you were very insistent because I remember saying, no, it's okay. Repulse is an amazing card. Let's give the blue-white deck. You're like, no, trust me, and it did come into play like many games.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the card was completely insane in that archetype.
But I'm splashing for it, and you know, 5-color green and Invasion. Blue's not really the crucial, of a color.
Yeah, because it doesn't have any of the fixing. Like obviously the green is all the I mean, it has like a couple of weird janky fixers, but that was such an incredible block. Do you remember what happened though about how I misregistered the deck and I left 2 cards off of my list? It was Emblazoned Golem and a Vindicate. I don't know how the fuck I remember this. Like, when did we qualify? 2000? 2001?
2000 or 2001.
In the qualifier. Yeah. And I remember like 3rd round in or something, they did random deck checks and they looked at my list, and I just randomly left 2 of my best cards off my list. Emblazoned Golem and Vindicate were just not on my list. I did not record them, and I don't know how. I think they got lumped in with lands or something. So I had to start, I got a game loss, and I had to start every first game with 2 basic lands and 2 of my best cards in my sideboard.
And we still won.
I still went undefeated somehow. Yeah, I mean, I guess the other whatever 15 cards I was playing with were pretty damn good.
They were. I remember you had Factor Fiction, but just like, yeah, I mean, it's really good memories. And like,
would have been 21 cards actually. Yeah.
You mentioning the 9/11 things, like, it's crazy because like now that I think back, and there's so many things that have like happened. Like I've been there for like a lot of historical things that which is cool because now I'm on broadcast and doing podcasts that bring up we'll get into one in a bit, but definitely this event was just like cool because I do remember the misregister, but it's just like you being we've known each other for quite a long time, and it was just cool. I feel like it was for people who moved on from Magic or whatever. I just finished competing in Starcraft, so it was a really painful process to me because like real-time games meant so much to me, and it was a time where I'm just like, I can't do this anymore. Like I'm gonna get slower, and the money's not there. I had my fun. It's time to get back to real life.
Was it just the APM thing that really pushed you away from it, or was the fact that it was just at the time there was no way to leverage being great at StarCraft into actually having a career?
No, at that time, there was a chance to move to South Korea to.
I remember we talked about that, yeah, because South Korea, like a decade ahead of its time with esports, they actually had a real thing going on there already.
it was really complicated. Obviously, you know, me being Asian, it already wasn't kosher, even though it's like I was in like the Mercury News, I was in Wired. I was paying for everything. You know, I had a job like being the pioneer of Starcraft esports,
Yeah.
like to the public and a competitor. And
you still had this career pressure from family.
That was one of the factors, but the .com boom was coming on, so the company was changing more towards like a gaming portal. Bad timing, maybe the product wasn't a fit. I know Dennis Fong went on to do other great things, and just like I transferred from content creation to programming, and it just feels like a shift because like I was like, if I'm not going to move to South Korea, it's time to put an end to this chapter.
I see. What year was that?
It was 2000. Like I stopped competing at the end of 1999, the World Championships, where I got third place, and then the end of that year, I just made that determination that I just decided that I put a close to it.
I see.
So and I cold turkey gaming for. You know, I had a girlfriend at the time, and I cold turkey for like quite a bit, but you know, it's in our blood. I didn't know I had certain abilities. Like, I'm like middle aged, man. I'm like 42. Like, I was tasked to do game design, which I don't study. But, you know, I played so many games and been competitive in them. Like, I intuitively was able to accomplish stuff. And, you know, I'm going to have a game license in commerce. Like, we have a deal and have a patent and a patent pending. So I'm just like, well, why didn't somebody just, like, ask me to design something? You know, I would have tried, you know.
What was the recent design thing?
They're both casino games. And I'm in a state where... You know, we've been competitive gamers our entire lives. So I was too polarized and linear into thinking that's the way I should be living life, which is like, you know, in poker sense, scraping out every fraction of an EV.
Yeah.
But when you're building a product, which, you know, you're a little bit older than me and you have successful products, you know how much effort goes into it and probably understand this better than I do. Sometimes when you're building a product, you are buying time to make sure things go through versus scraping out every fraction of progress in EV. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the process of game development in itself is, it evades any type of formula or recipe, I think. I've had a lot of people on the backbone, and I'm sure we'll get to discussing it, but on the backbone of the success of Path of Exile, people mostly who I know through the gaming world have come up to me, and they're aspiring game designers themselves. They're ambitious. They're working a 9-to-5 job that they don't like. They want to be independent, and they want to know, you know, what's the secret sauce? What can I do? I have an idea. I want to go out and strike out with my own game company and try something, and I want to do something. You know, what's the secret? What do I do? You know, where do I even get started? And it's such a difficult thing to communicate to people, because obviously there is certainly no formula to success. Like, for example, let's contrast that with something like someone who comes up to you and says, I want to be a professional poker player. How do I get started? Well, it's really quite easy to direct people to almost the owner's manual, the rule book on how to be a successful poker player. There are multiple very, very fundamentally important steps in that process that a person needs to take the time to come to understand. If they're in fact, I mean, obviously there's no substitute to just literally throwing tens of thousands of hours at it. That's probably the best answer of all, as is the answer to most things. But just like with sports practice, getting back to the disc golf clinic thing, there's two types of practice, right? There's quantity and quality. And quality practice will always supersede quantity practice. You can spend thousands of hours doing a sport wrong biomechanically, and you'll never ever improve. I see this constantly when I try to teach people how to throw a disc correctly. They've been doing it for 10 years, and they're as bad as they were in the first month. They're as good as they were the first month in, they've never improved past that point because all of their practice is quantity and none of it is quality. And so it's the same sort of thing with regards to, the development of really any product and so on too. I just think that there just aren't any succinct rules to that as well. And certainly there are people who've been playing poker for 15, 20, 30 years who are horrendous. They're totally horrible. And they have no basic understanding of any of the underlying basic strategies. They run based on superstition and gut instinct. And some of those gut instincts may result in them making the correct choice occasionally, but their fundamentals are so broken, they can only really be a losing player in the long term.
My narrative was more towards like, you know, you have a game design, you made a successful business out of it. Like that's, I mean, I guess when you're dealing with prices and Magic cards and valuations, you have a little bit of more practice than say I would, but it just like never occurred to me to, when I'm building a product now, I have to think about the financials. I have like legal bills, you know, I have to do marketing and stuff like that. Like as I'm waiting for the game to come out, my execution is now on building a foundation. The game's changed to building a foundation in survival versus maximizing EV, in which I could hit like a point where, especially in poker, like you lose and you don't have the resources to move on to the next step, because I'm in a state where I don't know what my costs are going to be. I'm trying to reduce them as much as possible. I control enough like media, broadcast, and IP that I think I'll be fine. I'm not like, the object isn't to win anymore. It's not to like take down Blackjack and Baccarat. It's just survive so I could, you know, reap rewards.
Yeah. I think that that's an excellent strategy to go into with regards to game development in general. The whole idea, if you look at game projects that come to market, a very sizable portion of them don't take into account that idea of survival enough. They basically, if you look at how they spend development money, they're so front-ended. They spend a ton of money initially, right? They get some investment money. They recruit the best staff. They overpromise to their employees in terms of stock options and things like that to get people to attract a really, really stalwart cast of people to make their game. And they overpay everybody. And then they're a year and a half into development or 2 years into development, and they completely run out of money. And so they're often put in this position where they have to do a bunch of really terrible things. First of all, they have to constrain the vision of the game. That's one of the worst things of all. But their entire idea is like 3/4 of the things that they promised. And a lot of the time, a lot of these games now are crowdfunded on things like Kickstarter and GoFundMe. And so somebody will go, there's some, I think it's called Project Entropia. There's this famous game that's been in development for 1 million years now called Project Entropia. And you want to talk about overpromise, underdeliver with that. Project Entropia has been in the pipeline for ages. And when you look at the things that they promised in that game versus what they'll likely be able to launch with, it's going to be like 10% of the promised features will actually make it into the game, and everybody will be furious about it because they just massively overpromised and will automatically, it's inevitably under-deliver when the actual game comes out. And that's obviously a huge mistake that you can make with regards to Kickstarters and stuff. So a lot of these companies start out with this grand vision, but then due to monetary reasons, they have to completely trim and prune away a lot of what they intended to do in order to actually make the game, to get into a form where it can actually release. And then so many games come out these days that are just totally unfinished. They just release a game that's not finished because they have no money left. They have no choice. What can they do? It's either close down the studio completely because they can't get any more funding, or just release the game in some hideously bugged state and just hope that enough people play it that gives you enough money to fix all the problems with it, and then eventually get it years down the line into something that resembles your actual vision.
Exactly. So this is kind of the dilemma that I always hit. So basically the way I live life plus development, it's just like, it's very like lower cost, like explosive kind of things versus like I need to optimize. Like I clearly in year one of execution, I'm like, if I optimize this, I'm screwed. There's no way I can sustain these costs, even though I know what the smartest thing to do is. So I'm just like more being, you know, a resourceful scrapper, so to say. And that's something that like you quantified, there's so many graveyards of these things, and maybe they could have been amazing products, but it's just not practical to aim for something like that with the amount of time, resources. And I think you have a good network, like you're really good friends. Like there's a lot of civil war in companies that just cause it to dissolve regardless of products.
Yeah, that's inevitable. That I've heard plenty of Civil War stories relayed to me through by Matt Place. Because Matt's actually he's worked for, I think at this point, 4 different game companies. He worked for Upper Deck originally, making, I think, the WoW TCG. And then he worked for Wizards of the Coast for about 6 or 7 years. And then he was... Blizzard, too. Yeah, and then eventually he finished at Blizzard. But he was actually, he worked for a company called Direwolf Studios, a game development company based out in Colorado that for several years was working on this super secret project that he couldn't tell me about, which actually turned out to be a card game, a Hearthstone style card game based in the League of Legends IP. They were it was like a secret project that was funded by Riot to try to make, they must have known about Hearthstone because I think it was kind of going on quietly in the background. This is when Hearthstone was still in development. But basically they were developing their own digital TCG in parallel with Hearthstone, but using the Riot IP, and they couldn't say anything about it. And then they were developing it, and Matt was the lead on that project for several years. And then eventually, I think Hearthstone came out in beta, and the contrast between what they were developing and Hearthstone was so gigantic that Riot was rightfully concerned that their game would be a laughingstock. And they said, we can't really have this very rough, very primitive looking TCG associated with our brand that people will automatically compare to Hearthstone, obviously unfavorably. And they pulled the plug on the project. They just said, okay, we're done. Wow. We've invested $10 million. We're going to cut our losses. We're just going to walk away from it.
Holy cow. Yeah.
Yeah. And that left, of course, the studio and all the people associated with adrift. And Matt had been promised bonuses and equity based on how well the game that he had been working on was going to do. So getting back to what you were saying about, like infighting and stuff, there was all of this sort of civil war that went on inside the studio. I wasn't privy to too much of it. This is obviously second or third hand information, but there was tons of infighting. And eventually he's just like, I've invested the last 3 or 4 years of my life into this thing. I can't do this anymore. And he walked away. And that's when he was subsequently hired by Blizzard. And he actually worked on Hearthstone with Blizzard for, I think, not very long, 9 months or something.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, and I was just going to say, and then Matt was a relatively small, somewhat early investor in Path of Exile, actually, back in 2011. And then, so we were at the time when he was doing all the final stuff at Blizzard, we were transacting the sale of the company to Tencent. And that transpired in April of 2018, so a little over 2 years ago. And Matt's share from that sale was enough to get him to leave his Blizzard job.
Blizzard's getting some really bad press, and I don't want to ever say bad things about Blizzard because they've obviously been integral in my career.
They've made some utterly amazing games that I've played to this day.
And I mean that's one of the stranger relationships. But the thing is, a lot of my good friends that work there aren't there anymore, and I was actually interested in maybe doing something for Hearthstone, but it's not gonna.
Oh, you mean actually? Yeah, I mean, you told me that you felt that you could turn pro at Hearthstone if you wanted to put in the hours.
Yeah, I don't think anybody doubts that. Like, to be honest, like I'm literally just like scraping by, and I hit Legend every month. It's like I did compete like 2019 Wild, which is very similar to Type 1, which is why I liked that format. I got 25th in US.
Wow. No
they changed the format like right before, so one of the decks that I was preparing for got outdated. But the thing is, like, I have 2 companies, a job, and I'm trying to compete. It's just like I was like literally dying of exhaustion when I was competing. And during round 2, and thank God this digital, this was Magic the Gathering, and we're in a live setting. There's no way I could have done it. I would have like fallen asleep at the table. But because I was at home, I was able to like rest in between and just like. In a way that I wasn't as diligent with Magic, like meticulous, like I'm trying to win, but this I'm just like, I'm actually, I prepared for a month, I'm trying, and then I was so paranoid and meticulous about each play.
Yeah.
That, I just really tried, and like I wish I know I could perform better if I had more time, and I don't have any teammates too. That's your network is very important.
Absolutely, I can't imagine anything more important for doing well at a game like Hearthstone, where you have to be able to. It's such the constructed version of Hearthstone is so interesting because in Magic, the difference between two decks of relatively similar strategy will often be a lot of cards. It'll be 10, 15 cards sometimes. In Hearthstone, it's like one card is different in your deck, and that's a huge, enormous difference that will ripple through the whole event. You just happen to have this one, like you're running an acidic slime and somebody is, or the ooze. It's the ooze, acidic ooze, 3/2.
Ooze, slime is Magic. Ooze is...
Yeah, acidic slime is in Magic. The ooze is the 3/2. They're both green, right? It's the 3/2 that destroys a weapon. But like the fact that one guy chooses to run ooze and the other guy chooses to run Harrison Ford or whatever, the thing that destroys
and gets the cards
and draws cards, right? Like that it doesn't seem like that big of a difference, but that difference in deck construction can really make an entire, like that can totally change how you go through the whole event. The fact that one guy has the card drawing thing and it happens to be all slow control warriors or whatever, and he's getting insane value the whole time out of it because he has this one card that's different.
Yeah, I agree, and like there are beautiful, like I've been very public on this too. I think Magic's a more fun game. I think it's easier to play Hearthstone due to the convenience. I do think Hearthstone does a lot of things, really well, especially since I can't, you can't play during your opponent's turn, in which in Magic you can.
Right,
and secrets is like by a programming limitation is like, once it's triggered, the second thing that would trigger it doesn't exist.
Yeah, it turns out counterspell's a lot worse when it triggers automatically the next time your opponent plays a spell versus like the best thing in the deck.
Yeah. So
it's a little worse.
I do want to compliment Blizzard on the getting it this far and what the product is. I do have high admiration for it, especially the convenience factor of Hearthstone.
One thing that I think that can't be understated too in the role of Hearthstone's success and propagation is that the game is fundamentally fun to watch, and that's the thing that really sets it apart from Magic. Long time ago in this conversation, I think this came up during our recorded conversation, but I was talking about how this related to the question about Scaf Elias and the formulation of the Pro Tour, because if you have a strong constitution, you can go on YouTube and you can look for, I don't know exactly what the search terms would be, but if you dig around, you'll be able to find advertisements that were produced by Wizard of the Coast, I think around 1998, 1999. They were trying for a little while, gamely trying to promote the game through the regular channels that products were normally promoted through in the early days in the age of television and pre-internet, which was through advertisements, regular video, 30-second video advertisements. You try to think of like trying to make people get excited to play Magic the Gathering in a 30-second spot on.
That's really hard.
That is a real challenge. I don't think that anyone on earth, no genius advertising executive on earth is up to that task, I think, because the game it's like trying to promote, chess in an advertisement. You can never do it justice. All you can do is just make it look awful, like something no one would ever want to do. And
you've been exposed to this task for like a long time. Do you think you could do it right now? Or what would be your best guess?
If I could promote Magic through video medium? Yeah. Absolutely not. No, I could never do it justice. It's just impossible.
Hearthstone has a really good ad, but it's like have you seen it? Or what? They have a lot of ads.
I certainly have seen it, but this gets back to another point that I was going to make, and this relates to the fact that one of them is a spectator sport and one isn't. And I know that Magic Arena has sort of changed the conversation a little bit. Magic Arena are you familiar with it much?
I know of it. Like right now, as you know, I have way too much on my plate, and something like getting a conversation with you is like literally, I've been, it's been on my mind for like a long time.
I see. That's cool. Well, Magic Arena came out in, I think it's, don't quote me on this. I think it's a couple years old now. But it was an attempt to make Magic aesthetically pleasing to watch. Simpler to play, streamlined for online play, and also a far more enjoyable spectator experience. There's a lot more stuff is easy to discern from the perspective of a viewer in a game of Arena And in general, the presentation is much more flashy. There's tons of animations, there's lots of cool sounds, things smash into each other with big impact explosions. There's lots of digital effects. You know, the spells and the fireballs cause these big roaring contrails of sparks and stuff. It looks really cool. And it's clearly an attempt to take Magic out of that staid, completely sterile environment that Magic Online is, right? Which is basically just meant to be a recreation of tabletop Magic.
Yeah.
And take it into the modern day so that it can stand side by side with a game like Hearthstone and look comparable. And they've done very well. Magic Arena is incredibly successful. It's easily the most successful and accessible version of digital Magic that's ever existed. Far more accessible than Magic Online, which unfortunately still has all of the warts that are attached to the regular paper game. Right. So the very fact that when you play a game of Magic Online, literally every time I have to do anything that interacts with the stack, my opponent has to say, no, I don't want to respond. That just makes the game so cumbersome. And Magic Arena circumvents a lot of those interactions by having an intelligence about what the players have in their hand and what options are available to them at the time.
But so that's the thing, like the advertising for this advertising for Hearthstone actually has very little to do with the game. So I think people, especially like us who are hardcore gamers, are too focused on the fact that we're trying to sell the game versus sell the emotion.
Yeah, no, that's a very valid point. I agree with you there. And I think that if there were a few famous kind of viral Magic ads that they did experiment with that I think did get some more traction. And like you said, they had absolutely nothing to do with the game at all. One of them was the famous thing where there's an org or something, and they're making a monster in a lab, and there's an org involved.
Mm-hmm. That's a
famous Magic viral. There's a guy in a lab coat and stuff. Apparently this ad actually was quite successful and people liked it, and it got them curious about what Magic might be.
Yeah.
But the ads that they were producing before that, the 1990s ads, they are unbelievably cringy.
I'm sure.
So bad. They're such bad ads that if I didn't know anything about Magic and I saw that ad, I would go out of my way to avoid that game, not play it, because it looks so incredibly terrible in terms of its portrayal, the way that people act in it and stuff. It's god awful. So credit SCAF with recognizing the fact that in 1996, the traditional avenues of promoting Magic the Gathering were failing. Remember, the Pro Tour had, for a time, they were actually broadcasting matches, top 8 matches from both Nationals and from the Pro Tour on ESPN2 with commentary and editing. They brought in the guy who was associated with the X Games at the time. Was by far the way that they figured out to promote Magic to the masses. They could point at the Pro Tour, they could promote the Pro Tour players, and they could say, listen, if you're
good enough,
a kid at home, right, and you're 15, you can play on the Super Series, or you're 20 and you're in college or you're out of college and you've got time to devote to this game, you could go and be a world famous player, and you could win $45,000 playing in an event, which was unheard of at the time. I mean, what kind of non-sports events were paying prizes like that at the time, other than maybe the South Korea esports events were probably paying similar amounts of money, maybe more?
It ramped up. So that one was $2,500, and then the second place one was $7K, and the top prize was $10K. So they started ramping up, that's why it was such a tough call. Like, it was definitely on the plate for me to continue competing in Starcraft, but the thing is, like, moving to another country, plus like not being able to speak the language, plus like, you know, it could have been a fad. Like, I don't think the way it was uptrending, all the esports at the time were uptrending. I don't think it was gonna be a fad, but honestly, we're in America, and the Magic the Gathering has this issue too, in which like you have a lot of better options in life than being a professional gamer.
Absolutely, and until Twitch TV and Twitch TV promotion of, I mean, obviously there are lots of gamers now who, because of Twitch TV, have become literal celebrities.
Yeah.
Who've transcended even the world of gaming. You know, take Ninja, for example. You know, Ninja's playing Fortnite against Drake and LeBron James and stuff, right? Like he's like a legit celebrity from what happened with Twitch TV. So gamers have they've transcended that, but that's a very, very recent event. That's only within the last couple of years that mainstream gamers have suddenly been able to be catapulted up to the same kind of level of respect and status that South Korean celebrity gamers have been enjoying for 20 years, at least based on what I've heard.
Some stuff is, yeah, it is true, but like it's all relative too. Says like I get recognized more for poker stuff now in Live at the Bike than I did for Starcraft, but people still recognize me for Starcraft. But because the video forum,
more there, people watch it.
Yeah, but I'm also in LA, in which there's too many famous people. Like, so the fact that I even get recognized in the sea of like so many, like I've ran into so many celebrities
at that
in LA,
yeah.
in LA in general. It's just not even special, I guess. It's just like as an experience, it's not that interesting. So like when Ninja does his stuff, it's like cool, but me personally, and this may not be universal, are more concerned about gaming as a reputation as an industry. So like when you hear League of Legends has more viewers, the World Championships has more viewers than the Super Bowl streaming, that's clickbait, because it's not. It's like, it's awesome that it's surpassed that number, but people can tune in and tune out of a stream. And in the Super Bowl, the people who are watching the Super Bowl are generally there for the entire thing.
Totally, because it's a huge social event.
Right. So like, while it's awesome and impressive they do that, or Ninja gets the stuff, it's like, I personally care more about when a random person from a different industry that doesn't know anything about gaming comes up to me. They don't do something that Joe Rogan and Jimmy Kimmel did, which is like, or I just want to be like, I don't even want anything special. Just like, oh, you do this, you're on broadcast of poker, or you were Starcraft world champion. That's cool. That's it. I don't really care for anything as long as it's not negative. So to me, Ninjas obviously and other gamers are helping with that, but as long as it goes into that direction, I don't really care about the celebrity aspect, like that kind of echelon.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously you can make comments about the sort of dubious advantages and qualities of celebrity in general, where we live in a culture that very unjustly reveres celebrities and gives them all of this deference and respect that for the most part is unearned, I think. So I think that celebrity is something that there's very little purpose in actually aspiring to that in general, because I think that most people who are celebrities, I think most of them will sort of tell you like this experience is mostly good. Negative. Yeah, it's not good at all. You get recognized, sure, and that's fun, I'm sure, for a week, and then you have the rest of your life where everybody views you a specific way, everybody treats you differently. You can never even really be sure if people's engagement with you is sincere or not.
Right.
Because really they just want a selfie and they want to brag to their friends on Instagram who they met at a restaurant, right? They have no respect. They don't know anything about you. They certainly don't respect you for that. It's just entirely about promoting themselves in social media.
And they want your professional respect versus to earning it themselves. Like, like whatever you are in Magic the Gathering, I'm sure you're known for other things too, but that's what I was introduced to you, or it was introduced to me, and then I meet you in person, and then the interaction with you in person plus the mentoring process, and that to me was like the cool aspect of knowing you. And then of course we didn't finish this, but going, us qualifying for Pro Tour, and then now having this podcast, it's like a continuation of something that happened in our youth. That to me, that's the cool aspect, I guess.
Have you ever told anybody your story about the cube? You're shared that on
I did. I told Tom Martell, but the thing is, I didn't know. Like, I obviously would be flattered if I was credited with it. And I remember holding these 3 big boxes around in the World Series. I'm like, let's draft. And David Williams was there, Casey McCarroll was there, blah, blah, blah. But I don't know. I'd be very glad and grateful to be credited with.
Whenever I've told the story of the cube, because it's part of the Magic lexicon at this point. Magic Online has a series of cubes that they roll out. At any given time, there's always a cube that's one of the primary chief draft formats. And it's so funny because the origin story of the deck I think almost nobody even knows why it's called the cube at all. The story that I've told people is that the initial box that you guys had the cards for your initial draft set in, it was 3.
Yeah.
It wasn't always 3 though. I imagine.
Okay, yeah. It started as 1 and then 2, and then it got to the point where there are just too many individual cards.
Yeah.
So I can tell the story from my point of view. So when I was at UC,
obviously you do it far more justice than I would, and it's important for me to hear it too because I will continue to relay it.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you're relaying, and I would be glad to get credit for this. In UCSD, and I told this to John Sasso too, a Supersize, like, I'm gonna make a draft set with 1 of every individual card. And I brought it to, I started doing it. Of course, I'm missing a lot of the expensive cards, but when people play it, they're like, oh my God, this is so fun, because you already know there's no duplicates. And then there's so many tough decisions, like bombs in certain sets, in certain eras, like how do they compare? Like,
right, totally.
For example, Curse Scroll. Curse Scroll is not very good in Cube.
That's a great example. I think that's literally the best example of this idea that you're talking about, but go on.
So like in Tempest, if you open Curse Scroll, boom, you don't even look at the rest of the pack.
Definitely not. And then you
look at the rest of the pack just to know what's out there. Yeah.
Yes.
But but then in Cube, you have stuff like Curse Scroll, Land Tax, like I'm trying to think of some like Morphling.
Yeah.
Or an X-Spell. Yeah, or an X-Spell. And X-Spells are
Fireball, yeah.
What's amazing about the X-Spells, at least in the version that I have, is that they are very good, but they aren't necessarily first picks. There's a lot of bombs that are just like straight up better.
Totally.
Something like the blue-black Dimir Guildmage, is that what it's called?
Yeah. Dimir Guildmage.
That guy is nuts.
Yeah,
like he's like not necessarily a bomb, but if there's no like super bomb, he's like one of the top guys for sure.
Totally, absolutely. It's just a card that can completely snowball into a win all by itself. It's a 2-drop. It's a 2/2 for 2, so it's just solid in that regard.
And he's a tribute to the deck, James Day Tillman Disrupting Scepter in 1 card.
James Day Tillman Scepter in 1 card. Yeah, both source.
Yeah, I made the cube, and it was like 1, and that's why it's called the cube, because it's in those big ass boxes. And then I had in San Diego.
Was it technically in a rectangular box though?
Yeah,
like
rectangular box, but
important part of the story because it's not literally a cube. I've always said like you actually happen to just have this box that was a literal cube, and so all the cards fit nicely in there. And
oh no, it was those big ass.
My own imagination.
I'm glad to whatever. It's like I thought it was so awesome because as you know I have the most fun drafting. My performance shows that I'm better in constructed, but just drafting so has a feel that is just like unmatched in constructed. So we have this cube, or I create this cube. I have one, and then in UC San Diego, I have a buddy, Chris Chang, who's a PhD student, and then David Fisher and like Andy Wang. So we would draft this like throughout the night, and it's like I remember back when we were at match play, we would draft, and then at some point you're the responsible one. You're like, I got to go home, but that would last until like 2-3 a.m.
Not very responsible, I assure you. Yeah, normally we would leave that place and then go to Denny's.
So
Denny's is 24 hours a week.
Yeah, and Lions.
Lions. That's right. The low rent Denny's.
The cube, we were so degen, and I haven't played like 24 hours / more than 24 hours in the game for like a really long time. But then when we had that, we actually drafted over 24 hours.
Wow.
So then one World Series of Poker came, and everybody was in the degen poker mode, and I just wanted to cube draft. So I brought that thing over, and in the one house, Euban, David Williams, Casey McCarroll, and a couple other Magic players. And we drafted it, and they were like, oh my God, this is awesome. But, money beats Magic at that mid-20s age. So even though they were really excited about it, that, they went off. But I just kept building and building it until it was 3 boxes. And then, I have real life responsibilities. So I ended up just like not continuing. So I don't know what happened, but at some point it actually became a thing.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of when it actually started to propagate virally, beyond just hearing about it as something that you did, because you would write to me periodically. I don't remember what avenue you were communicating with me in. I remember having conversations with you when I was living in Santa Barbara, and I lived in Santa Barbara between 2003 and 2007. So I remember you writing to me and asking me questions, like, for example, just asking me, which card do you think is the best card, period, in the cube, based on the card set? What card's going to be most consistently insane? And I think that our agreement was, obviously outside, you had power in it, though. You had Ancestral Recall and stuff, right?
I did, but it got to a point where they come up so infrequently.
Yeah, once you dilute it so much, it becomes less of a factor. But I remember managing and during the conversation, apropos what we were talking about before, in the card Treachery, for example, being another just absolutely top 5 windmill slam it 100% of the time. Like, you'd take Treachery over Black Lotus a lot of the time. And actually what's interesting is that I have my own cube that I've been working on and developing for more than a decade, actually. It's gone through a million iterations and probably has no more than 20% of the cards in there were cards that it had when I first built it. But seeing this sort of steady evolution and coming to understand, I've kind of touched on so many things in the creation of this cube. The big defining thing, though, that separates the cube that you guys played from the cube that most people who have heard of the term in modern day is that when you guys drafted your cube, you would always be dealing with you'd be drafting a very small subset of a larger card pool every time. Like, you do a draft with 4 people, your card pool is 1,200 cards. 4 people is only, what is that? It's only 12 packs, right? So 12 packs times 15, you're dealing with whatever, like 160 cards. It's a tiny cross section of a much bigger chunk of stuff.
Yep.
As a result of that, it's much harder to go after particular archetypes, because in that small subsection of the cube, an entire archetype might not be even supported. So, like, for example, you open a pack and you go, damn, I really love mono red, I want to draft Jackal Pup. So you draft Jackal Pup first, but then just by pure coincidence, all the other good aggro creatures are in the other parts of the cube, and you wind up with a mono red deck where you have 1/1 drop, and then all your other things are 3s, because there were just no drops, right? You could not draft mono red, and you got screwed because you picked mono red to go with. You took Jackal Pup, then you took Lightning Bolt, and you're like, okay, well, I'll just take this 3-mana thing, and I guess I'll take this 4-mana thing, and shit, there's no good red cards, I'll take a green card, and you're stuck in red. Before you know it, you have the worst deck in the world. And so this is something that I kind of recognized in my own cube, because the cubes that you and I were drafting, unlike the cubes that are drafted on Magic Online. In Magic Online, every card in the cube is in the pool every time you draft, 100% of the time. I believe that that's correct. I'm not 100% sure, but if you look at the list, because they publish the contents of every cube, if you look at the list, the list is 8 players, so it's 24 packs times 15, and that is the cube. That's the same. You're dealing with the same set of cards every single time, which obviously rewards foresight and preparation. But more importantly, if you draft a specific archetype, you always know that the archetype is going to be in play. Yeah. There's always going to be a Storm deck. There's always going to be a Splinter Twin Kiki-Jiki deck. There's always going to be a mono red deck. All the pieces are there every single time. So you can draft knowing that with that foresight and count on being able to get that deck consistently, provided that you're able to pick up the key pieces for it. You can look for it. You always know that there's going to be one of every dual land. And so you can play around that. So if you draft a fetch land, you know, like if you prioritize drafting a fetch land, you know that there's going to be multiple dual lands that intersect with that fetch land in the pool at that moment, and it's guaranteed. And that's so huge in terms of how you can go about constructing your cube, because you can actually put real archetypes into it. So I would say that for people out there listening to this podcast who want to build their own cubes, and you should give Wayne full credit for the concept, you need to decide if you're going to always be drafting your cube with 8 players or 4 players or whatever, and you need to adjust your card pool accordingly. Because what will actually happen is if you make a broader subset of cards, like let's say, in my case, I think my cube is around 600 cards usually, so it's enough to make around 36 to 38 packs total. And we're only drafting a small subset of that. What actually happens over time is you'll see time and time again that savvy players will ignore all the fast stuff. They ignore all the beatdown creatures. They'll go like 14th and 15th pick, because beatdown is not a consistent strategy. It's one of those cards, one of those deck archetypes that requires a critical mass of mana development, right? You need a mana curve. You need to make a real proper aggressive deck, you need like 4 or 5 1 drops. and then you need 7 or 8 2-drops, and then a few 3s, maybe a couple of 4s, and then some removal and land, and that's your deck. You're never ever going to consistently get that when you're dealing with 1,200 cards and you're only looking at a small subsection of that. It just won't work. So what happens is that reinforces the behavior where people will go and they'll draft and they'll just ignore the Savannah Lands. They'll just never take Savannah Lands because they know that it's a trap. And gradually over time, what happens is, since I'm constantly editing the deck based on the data, what cards are going 14th and 15th pick consistently? Well, I'm like, well, shit, nobody's drafted Jackal-Pup the last 9 drafts. It's gone 15th pick. And they pull it out. Or I'm sorry, so I pull the card out of the pool. And then I do that for lots of the other 1-drops, basically the aggro creature 1-drops. And before you know it, steadily evolving over time, the entire cube just shifts into this sort of weird mid-range, late-game bomby strategy. And there's no opportunity to play beatdown at all because all the beatdown creatures have been taken out. So you have to be very careful when you're constructing it. What really fundamentally matters as far as how you go about constructing your cube is how many people do you intend to be drafting this with in any given thing. And if like half or more of the cards are in play in every draft that you do and that's guaranteed, then you can actually put archetypes in. Otherwise, don't even bother. Just put in lots of good stuff and just accept the fact that it's going to be mid-range.
I enjoyed the fact that there were no archetypes because even in that, like you said, there's less beatdown. So when you do go beatdown, like you start picking up stupid things, like even 2 2s for 3, like morph creatures increase in value, like hill giants are, and those end up being fast enough in those environments it's a beatdown, especially if everyone's curve is going higher up. But it's a different era, so like I'm just glad it caught on because I thought it was so fun just comparing bombs with bombs and just like how certain bombs in certain formats, when you completely blast out the environment, how they just like completely devalue.
Yeah, I mean, think of cards like original bombs like Shivan and Sarah Angel, completely overshadowed by modern design. And that's obviously that's a quality of Magic power creep in general. I mean, Magic power creep has gotten, particularly with regards to Planeswalkers. I think Planeswalkers as a class of cards have just completely shifted everything about the game so fundamentally. And not only are Planeswalkers insanely powerful, but they've been really, really pushing Planeswalkers as a thing too, because Planeswalkers are sexy and they sell sets, they sell packs. There's an insane Planeswalker at 3 mana. People will buy packs to get that Planeswalker because it's super exciting to have it. The problem is that you know who LSV is, obviously, Luis Scott Vargas.
Yes. Yeah.
Of course. I mean, he's another player from our era. I met him.
Was he?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, maybe a little bit. He's a few years younger. I met LSV actually when he was going to UC Davis when I moved there in 1999.
Oh, okay. I thought
he was just like an 18-year-old kid who played at the local game store, who I was obviously very impressed by his abilities. At the time I was a very serious competitive player, so I kind of approached him as the way that I did everybody else. He had sort of a combination competitor/mentor role. But I mean, obviously he's a genius and he doesn't need any mentoring. He's figured out far more than I ever have about the game.
Yeah.
But LSV he's under the employ of Channel Fireball, actually.
Yep.
That's his company. And he's one of their spokespeople. And incidentally, actually, he also worked with Matt Place on that game in Colorado, the Riot Project.
Wow.
Which actually eventually released. They completely rebranded and changed all of the art and the entire IP and re-released it, or eventually officially released it. The game is called Eternal. And you download it and play it for free on iOS and other platforms. And it's actually quite fun. It's a very interesting hybrid of Magic and Hearthstone, although I'd say it's closer to Magic than it is to Hearthstone. They try to preserve a lot of what makes Magic fun and unique, including the randomness of mana, for example, is also in Eternal. The game's definitely worth taking a look at. But anyway, LSV I don't think he's affiliated with the game anymore. He used to be a spokesperson for it when he was working on it. But anyway, his most popular videos, I think, on YouTube to this day are Vintage Cube. And if you've never watched an LSV Vintage Cube video, you're doing yourself a grand disservice. If you haven't watched them, you should definitely do it.
I'll take a look.
Yeah, he just posted, because the Vintage Cube sort of it cycles on and off being available. I think about every 3 months they have it available again for a couple of weeks. And when it's available, LSV plays it compulsively. He plays, I think, more than 10 times, like 10 full, 3-round drafts in Vintage Cube. with commentary, and he does it in real time, and it's quite amazing to watch because obviously he's an incredibly skilled player. He's a Hall of Famer, and just watching his drafting and thought process, particularly with regards to the archetypes that I was talking about, it's really fascinating because most of the time when I watch people draft, I can kind of figure out what they're going to take, and with him, it's often very hard to discern exactly what he's going to
really
take.
Wow.
But his results are excellent. I mean, he seems to do extremely well. And he's told me several times that Vintage Cube is by far his favorite form of Magic, period. Outside of any format at all. He loves it the most. Like, he waits for it patiently for months, and he's just chomping at the bit, waiting for the next opportunity to play Vintage Cube. So you've inspired someone as great and famous as LSV in terms of his Magic passions.
Well, I mean, you started me. Yeah, so then Magic, I guess, after Magic, you did the Diablo 2 stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, Diablo sort of arrived during this segue period where I'd been playing Magic professionally really since mid-1994 up through, I mean, I was playing it professionally before there was an actual pro tour, because it was, when I say professional, right, when you do something as a lifestyle choice and your livelihood kind of depends on how well you do at it, then you're a de facto professional, even if you're not.
Professional Gamer Podcast, there's the icon, so.
Yeah, exactly. So I was definitely a professional Magic player before the Pro Tour began. And then I did the Pro Tour thing for 4 years. And as you know from your own experience, pretty much from esports, it becomes increasingly hard to justify the amount of time you're investing in this, essentially in a hobby, for a very, very inconsistent financial return.
Yep.
I'm sure many people who are poker players have had to do this sort of self-reflection and self-examination too. This idea of like, am I really good enough to continue to do this? Because my results are not aligning with, I win occasionally, but my results are not aligning with my expectation. And I'm sinking inordinate amounts of time into this activity at the expense of other things I could be doing in my life, because that's something you always have to factor in. It's not just that you're not winning money doing the thing that you're passionate about, but you're also not advancing another career that might actually lead somewhere too. And I was increasingly really starting to feel that around 1999, 2000, with regards to Magic. It was extremely hard to justify the amount of time that was necessary to really stay at the very top of the game to be competitive as a pro. Because there were people at that point, I guess I was 25 or 26.
Finkel and Kai Boudet were names, I think.
Yeah, they were, that was certainly the period when they had become very dominant. Finkel, I think he's 4 years younger than me, 3 or 4 years younger. But yeah, obviously he was a household name, and he had enjoyed a level of financial success at the game that was really unprecedented at that point. Even the best players, nobody had done more than like win one Pro Tour and make top 8 a couple of times. But unless you won, even if you got second, and certainly if you got top 4, the amount of money that you got relative to maintaining the lifestyle was just not enough at all.
Right.
I lived basically as a bare bones, subsistence, starvation Magic player, this itinerant Magic player during that entire period, from really 1995, when I started really when I dropped out or took a leave of absence from Santa Cruz, up until 2000-ish. I had no money. I was absolutely destitute. When I was a pro player, I remember going to Pro Tour Mainz in Germany. It's a beautiful ancient city, former East Germany, I think. And I was so poor. I was flown out there. I had a sponsor who paid for my hotel and my plane flight to wear their shirt. I don't even remember what it was for. It was something that Mark Justice brokered. I was so poor that the only food I ate on this whole trip was the continental breakfast at the hotel in the morning. I couldn't even afford food at the venue or anything. So I'd go eat the breakfast. I couldn't afford transportation. So I walked from the hotel 2 miles or whatever to the tournament center in the morning at like 6:30 in the morning through downtown Mainz, played in the event the whole day, and then walked home or walked back to the hotel and just went to bed. There was nothing else for me to do. Like, that was really my life for years. And I had the stamina and the passion to do it in my early 20s.
Oh yeah.
But by the time that, like 2000 had rolled around, it was just getting increasingly hard to justify the time. And my grandfather in particular would call me up all the time and say, what are you doing with your life? You have a lot of potential. You could do really well at a lot of things if you really apply yourself. Why are you wasting your time with this stupid game still?
And he was right.
The truth is, though, is that honestly, the years that I invested in Magic, and not only what that taught me in terms of really, really devoting myself, because that was the first opportunity I had to really devote myself to something to a mastery level. You know, up to that point, I had played Street Fighter, but it was always in parallel with all these other things, you know, doing high school and so on, and then college. I'd never really invested the time to really, truly be great at Street Fighter, because I just couldn't, even if I'd wanted to. I ran and wrestled competitively in high school, but I never was able to devote the time to become particularly great at those things either. But Magic was the first time that I was able to put 10,000 plus hours into something and became truly great at it. So it was very hard for me to walk away from that, to sort of turn my back on all that investment, particularly because I felt like it had never been something that had really risen to its full potential.
Yeah.
You know, that it was too early, but it became too hard to justify the time and emotional investment. It was so frustrating to play in those events. You know, I would practice for months, and, you know, as you know, just the short-term RNG that's endemic to Magic is so high that you could just scrub out in tournament after tournament after tournament, no matter how much preparation you had. It's just like poker in that way.
Yeah.
You can be the best poker player at your entire casino for a month and do nothing but lose.
Yep.
And you have to, not only do you have to have the emotional resiliency to go through that and endurance, but you need to have the bankroll too, right? The bankroll management is the fundamental key to surviving a period like that. And many people go broke and can never come back. And in Magic, you never even have the potential upside that poker can afford you, where you can go on a hot streak and you can win $200,000 and then live off that for a couple of years. You know, like that doesn't exist in Magic at all. You might do well. And when I did well, I made top 8 twice in relatively a short span of time on the Pro Tour, season 1 and season 2. My net win from that was $8,400. $8,400 spread out across 2 years. And that's 2 top 8s. That's doing really, really well. And I had a top 16 as well in there too, which won me like $3,200 or something. But I mean, it's way
insane.
Below a slave wage. It's nothing, right?
Yeah.
It's totally unsustainable. So by meant to do this, and I'm very good at it, but at a certain point, duty calls. You know, I need to get serious about my life, and I need to explore the things, because maybe I'm missing out on something really, really important. And it just so happens that the Diablo thing came along at that period in time. So I was able to go and devote myself to that, and relatively quickly began to pursue it as a business venture, because the secondary market was growing up. You know, it was in its infancy, but it was growing up in the context of that game. Diablo 2 was one of the very first games that people really started to take seriously, to the point where they wanted to spend large amounts of disposable income on it. And it seems quaint by modern day, where you've got people spending $15,000, $20,000 a month on games like Clash of Clans or Candy Crush and stuff, you know, these crazy addicts. Back then, it was totally unheard of, though, that people would pay $100 for an item. And so I was farming and finding items to sell in Diablo out of my little tiny cottage that I was living in Davis. But the reason why it matters so fundamentally is because it was through my playing Diablo that I forged my friendship with the person who would later become one of my absolute best friends and business partner, co-founder of Grimy Gear Games Development Studios in New Zealand, a guy named Chris Wilson. He and I met playing Diablo. We were both avid fans of the game. He was still going to high school, so he didn't have any business relationship to it at all. I was still doing stuff related to business, but we both had tremendous passion for the game. And just through our conversations that steadily evolved along with our friendship over the intervening 3 or 4 years, we started talking about how it seems like Blizzard is neglecting their curation of this game. They've kind of got Diablo to a point where they're happy with its balance and they're happy with its content. And now they clearly have their sight on other projects, and they're really kind of neglecting the Diablo mantle. And we haven't heard anything about a successor to this game. And there have been a few third-party groups of people who had actually created their own content to add to Diablo 2. There's a second expansion to it. The name doesn't immediately come to mind, but there's actually a third-party made secondary expansion to Diablo 2. Obviously you can't play it on Blizzard's closed servers. You can only play it on, the effectively open Battle.net. But an entire fan-made expansion was created. But other than that, the game was just totally neglected. And so we had a serious conversation about maybe we have the opportunity here to go and try to make our own version of this, because we're all avid gamers. We have we're at a period in our lives right now where we have enough stability that we might be able to go and devote ourselves, in the form of sweat equity, basically, devote ourselves for 2 to 3 years on a game development project, and maybe we can actually make something happen, provided that we can get other people of similar passion involved. And so to that end, Chris brought on board his very good friend from university, who was a couple years younger, a guy named Jonathan Rogers, who was absolutely genius, prodigious genius when it came to programming. And Jonathan actually had the capability to write an entire game engine from scratch, which gave us a huge evolutionary advantage as a company, because most of the time, if you're a fledgling game development studio and you want to go and make a game, well, you have to license an engine to build that game in. Even if you have the best idea, you need the actual framework, you need the tools, which is what that engine is, to create the game world. And you can add a lot, right, through art and music and design to that framework, to those tools, but the tools themselves are so fundamental to actually making the game work and to make it playable and modern that they're often indispensable for most game development companies. They have to start with an engine developed by a third party. And the problem with that is, of course, is that the engines aren't cheap. They usually require a initial fee as well as a secondary, it's almost like a royalty payment. You have to pay a percentage of your total revenue to the company that owns the game engine. The most common example of this is the game engine called the Unreal game engine.
Unreal,
which is, the Unreal Engine, which is an incredibly powerful, amazing engine to build games with. But the problem is, and I don't know the exact percentages, but the problem is if you build your game with the Unreal Engine, for all time, in perpetuity after that point, every dollar that you make, a portion of it goes to the guys that made the Unreal Engine. You have to pay, and it scales forever. There's no cap on it. So if you make a game that has $1 billion in annual revenue, you might have to give $200 million a year to the guys that made the engine that your game was built in. It scales indefinitely.
Sounds like a great business model.
And it's obviously a great business model for them, but conversely, the Unreal Engine is incredible. It allows indie developers, if they're willing to sort of take the plunge, it allows them to build a game world that they would never in a million years be able to build otherwise, because the tools themselves are so sophisticated, and they're constantly updating the Unreal Engine to make it better and better and better. So we had to make a choice about whether or not we wanted to build our game in an established engine or go out on our own. And because Jonathan was involved in the project, Jonathan was able to devote a year and a half or whatever, as long as it took him, to build our entire engine from scratch. So we were able to completely circumvent that conundrum at the very beginning. And then our fourth co-founder was another person that Chris and I also knew from the Diablo world, incidentally, a guy living in Sweden named Eric Olofsson, who just so happened to be finishing up his, graduate work in graphic design school, and was kind of a free agent and looking for something to do. And he was willing to move to emigrate from Sweden all the way out to New Zealand and become a New Zealand citizen in order to become our art/creative director. So we had this 4 people involved from the very beginning, and we started out in Chris's garage, literally his garage in a suburb in this place called New Lynn, which is about 7-8 miles south of Auckland, the biggest, it's not the capital of New Zealand, but the biggest city in New Zealand, in this little suburb in Chris's garage. And we had our whiteboard and our ideas, and we just set to work on making the game. And it was a very, very lengthy process that involved making a million mistakes and operating on all sorts of countless wrong assumptions, but steadily figuring things out over the span of roughly 5 intervening years. Designing the engine, hiring a few employees, just doing crazy amounts of overall game design, trying tons of ideas, streamlining the game concept, coming up with some really revolutionary ideas that are still preserved in the game to this day. And by 2011, by 2011, we had reached a point in our development where we had to bring in additional investment. We had kind of burned through our entire runway. Chris and I were basically at this point in our lives where we had to decide whether or not we were going to mortgage our houses to continue to fund the development of the game, or whether or not we were going to just have to, release it unfinished or something. But we did this thing where we, at kind of the behest of the public, because we had the game playable in what was called a closed alpha. So there were people that could basically, a very small subset of people could log in and play a version of the game, but the public had never seen it at large. There had been a few articles written about it, but really nothing in a broader sphere. And then we decided, at the encouragement of the public, to hold an open beta weekend. So we, for the very first time, we kind of opened the floodgates and we let anybody that wanted to play the game log in for the first time to play it. This was, I think, I want to say it was like late March or early April of 2012. And yeah, it was definitely 2012. And we were super nervous about doing this because at the time we felt like the game was still, like I certainly felt like the game was still in a really rudimentary state. And I was really worried because, like anything, right, you only get one chance to make a first impression. And if people flood into the game and they're like, this game's horrible, what the hell are you guys doing here? We're done, right? There's almost no getting past that because the narrative is going to be overwhelmingly negative going forward. It's just like launching a game that's not finished and your Metacritic reviews are all negative. You're screwed, basically. It's so hard to recover from that.
Yeah.
And so it was a huge risk to do it. And to our delight and tremendous surprise, the perception of the public, the people who logged in, and there were thousands and thousands of people who tried it that weekend, was almost unanimously positive. People really, really liked it. They really liked a ton of things about it, even the things about it that we were quite critical of internally. They really liked it. And most importantly, what we heard over and over and over again is, not only do we love what you're doing, but we want to help support it. We want to help this game. We see the potential of it. This is the game that we've always wanted to play. And we want to help you take it over the finish line. And so we, in about a week, we slapped together our own sort of internal Kickstarter style campaign, our own crowdfunding campaign that we hosted on our own site, again, to avoid having to pay a whole bunch of money to a third party like Kickstarter. Yeah. And we were able to raise, I think in the first week we raised $250,000, which was just mind blowing. And then we continued our crowdfunding for about a period of a full year, and we raised over $2 million more to develop the game in that span. And that allowed us, getting back to what I was saying before about how these broad, ambitious projects burn through all their runway early and then have to release something that's a shell of what they promised. That really allowed us to take the game to its natural conclusion. And so the version of Path of Exile that we finally released in October of 2013 was really good and really playable. It had its fair share of bugs. It had some fundamentally mechanical problems. One of the biggest problems of all had to do with latency, which of course you're very familiar with as an RTS player, right?
But you have that selection.
But the solution to latency in a game like Starcraft, of course, is that if somebody starts to lag, the whole game lags until that person resyncs, right? And maybe is there a period of time if they're disconnected for too long, they just get dropped, right? And then the game resumes without them?
Yeah, by the time we're competing, we're on LAN. So
right, you're on the LAN. I'm talking about playing like on Battle.net.
Yeah. So Battle.net, like during the ladder, if you disconnect, it became disconnects a loss because there were too many abusers. And then, during competition, if the qualifications were online, they would try to reconnect it. In fact, one of my games did disconnect, and even though disconnect is loss in the rules, they want to finish the tournament. They don't want to disconnect.
Of course, they can't just have that happen if it happens randomly in the tournament.
So they make every effort to reconnect.
So there's two basic ways that a game like Path of Exile or Diablo can be presented to the player, and the way that you can mechanically have the player the client interact with the server. There's what's called lockstep mode and there's predictive mode. And lockstep mode is what exists in Starcraft. It's basically the idea that if I click on my screen to have my siege tank go over here and go into siege mode, that action won't happen until the packet gets to the server, tells you what's going to happen, and the server sends it back to the player. Your tank is going to move here and sit down. And if you see your tank go over and on this point on the screen, you know it's there. You know it's there on the server while it's on your screen at the same time. You know that you're sieging on the bluff and you didn't in fact wander down the ramp and walk your siege tank into his base. Like you know that's what you're seeing is actually what's happening. And that's called basically, it's known as lockstep mode, at least in our game. Conversely, you have what's called predictive mode, which is how Diablo 2 was designed. And that's how Path of Exile was designed as well. And predictive mode is that basically there's this kind of interplay going on between the client and the server where the client sends a packet to the server and immediately on their screen, whatever action they executed, they'll see it happen in real time. So they'll see their guy, they click up above to go run into another room, they'll see their guy run up into the room on their screen. But on the server, that action is actually not going to happen until the packet telling the server that they moved into the room gets to the server, gets processed, and then sent back to the client. And what happens a lot of the time is that those two actions can be out of sync. On the player's screen, they're moving into the other room, but because of lag, it may not actually get processed on the server itself. The server might think, okay, well, let's say it takes like a full second to get to the server to get processed. Well, in that time, 3 monsters come down and they get in the way of the doorway. So the player sees himself run up into the next room where there's 3 monsters. But on the server, it doesn't get that command for another second. And in that span, the monsters walk into the doorway and block it. So on the server, the player who thinks he's run into the other room is in fact stuck in the first room with 3 monsters in front of him that are beating on him that he can't see.
Okay.
And the player is like running around, swinging and trying to do things. And all of a sudden he notices, wait a minute, I'm swinging my sword and it's not doing anything. I'm not seeing the monsters fall over. Oh shit, what just happened? I'm desynced. At which point they start seeing themselves taking damage and there's no monsters on the screen because that's what's happening on the server.
Right.
And unless a resyncing event happens that gets the two things to slam together all of a sudden, where the player would suddenly rubber band and jump back into the room and now, oh shit, I'm behind 3 monsters that are killing me. I better heal myself and kill them. If that event doesn't happen fast enough, you just die because you don't know what the hell's even happening. The problem was that when we built Path of Exile starting in 2006 and when Jonathan wrote its engine and so on, we were dealing with a version of the internet that had a lot of dial-up and was just generally a lot slower. New Zealand in particular had a really, really glacial internet. They did not have fiber optics and stuff back in that period of time. It was much, much slower. And so there was no way for us to do the lockstep mode that Starcraft uses. Because while it does work for an RTS, in the context of a fast action-paced action RPG, if you try to make it lockstep mode, you're constantly sticking. Your guy's running and then stopping for 30, 40, 50, 100 milliseconds, and then moving again and stopping and moving again and stopping. You just feel like you're in molasses. It's a really, really bad play experience that really makes the game feel terrible. And so we had to go and make our first version of Path of Exile fully predictive mode, which made it felt like it played really fluidly, but people were constantly dealing with this desynchronization problem. It was a disaster. And it really, really was, it was a problem to the point where so much of the early game's narrative was like, Path of Exile is awesome, but good luck playing it. You're just gonna be dying constantly to desync and you're gonna have a terrible time. That was sort of the meme that just propagated throughout the early narrative of the game. But despite that, we still got a lot of really, really good critical reviews. We actually, the big sort of seminal moment after the game's release was, I think a little bit later, either at the beginning, I think it was early in 2014, one of the biggest online gaming magazines, publications, a company called GameSpot, they do a year in review and they award awards to different categories. And then they have the biggest broad award that's sort of the equivalent of the Oscar for Best Picture, which is PC Game of the Year. They award that to one lucky title. And we were utterly astonished to find when they were announcing their candidates that Path of Exile was a candidate for PC Game of the Year for 2013 in GameSpot.
Sick.
Which was unbelievable. That's alongside AAA titles from major companies, companies that had spent over $100 million developing their games. And we were being mentioned in the same breath as them. Obviously we didn't expect to win, but it was unbelievable to just be mentioned. And this goes on for a couple of weeks and they announce the winner and our game is the fucking winner. We win the Game of the Year in GameSpot for 2013. So obviously we had done a lot of things right. And it took us a long time to really figure out how to properly monetize the game. That was one of the biggest things to overcome. Another thing was figuring out how to release content in a way that kept players engaged without boring them, that allowed them to come back. And this is something actually where we borrowed a ton of lessons from Wizards of the Coast in terms of the way that they figured out how to release their content in the cycles that they use. And I'll direct your viewers and you, by extension, to what I consider to be mandatory required viewing for anybody in the world who's interested in game development, really anybody who's interested in a business per se, that directly interacts with the public. Let me find the name of the title for you here so I don't misquote it. All right.
I had no idea because like I just go on Twitch and I see Path of Exile. I'm like, oh, that's Brian Weissman's game.
Yeah, man, we've been ranked as high as #1 on Twitch TV numerous times on release day and stuff. It's crazy. We've had hundreds of thousands of concurrent viewers and stuff. Okay, so the video. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, obviously I don't mean any disrespect. I obviously have huge respect for you. I just like because it's not my genre, so I wouldn't play.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, I mean, I wouldn't expect anything. Okay, so there's a bunch of different versions of this video. There's one officially released by GDC. Are you familiar with GDC?
I've been told to go, but I just don't have time and energy. But eventually I will.
Okay. Yeah. Well, for people who don't know about it, GDC stands for, it's a very creative name. It stands for Game Developers Conference. Yeah. An annual conference, the biggest of its kind in the world, I believe, and it's held normally in San Francisco in February of every year. I don't think it was held this year for obvious reasons. It was canceled. Maybe it's been moved to March. But Chris Wilson, co-founder, lead designer, CEO of Grinding Your Games, obviously very good friend of mine, and one of the primary reasons why the game has become the success that it is. I think if you were to find any individual who the success owes most to, it's him for sure, for many different reasons. But Chris was invited to give a talk at GDC last year in 2019. The talk was titled "Designing Path of Exile to be Played Forever." That's the name of the title. So if you want to look it up on YouTube, it is phenomenal. It's 1 hour long. It is one of the best hours you will ever spend in terms of really learning the ins and outs of what can make particularly a gaming company succeed and what can make a game company fail, and the lessons that we learned in that entire process, starting in 2006 and really going all the way up to the present, all the way up to 2019. I mean, we're still certainly learning more things, but it's such a perfect kind of dissemination of all of these critical qualities of what can make a game company succeed, and particularly with regards to a game that's designed in the same way that ours is. And many games are designed this way nowadays. You know, back in the day when Diablo 2 came out, for example, the typical way that a game was designed was you spend all your money and time developing a release product, you sell it for $50, everybody buys it, you know, hopefully you sell millions of copies. You do a few small patches and fixes to it, then you release one big expansion to it, and then you move on to the next project. That tends to be how a lot of these games were done. Certainly Diablo was done that way.
Starcraft as well.
And Starcraft as well, exactly. Brood War, they never made a game after Brood War, did they? Brood War was it.
Starcraft 2, but like they just, this is the pattern you said.
But under the mantle of Starcraft 1, they made Starcraft, the original game, right? What was it called? What was the original version of it called?
Wings of Liberty, I think.
Wings of Liberty, yeah. Or no, maybe that was Starcraft 2.
SO2.
I feel like that was, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Anyway, Starcraft 1, Brood War, which was objectively better than Starcraft, right? It was just a massive improvement, in the same way that Lord of Destruction was a big improvement on original Diablo. It added a ton of new cool stuff. And then they were done with it. They made a few little balance adjustments, but they pretty much moved on to developing other products, and eventually Starcraft 2 many years later. And Diablo was exactly the same way. Path of Exile, conversely, we set out from the very beginning, we said, we want this to be at least a 10-year project. So we're going to release the game, we're going to give it away for free, and then we are going to keep people engaged and coming back at regular intervals for at least 10 years. That was the short-term goal. And of course, that was our stated mission statement 7 years ago. We're now 7 years in, and the game is bigger now than it ever has been. Quite a bit bigger. If you go back every year, the game was growing exponentially, starting in around 2016 all the way up until the present. But Chris's talk addresses that idea. It addresses that business model. And I think that a game like that is probably the easiest thing to develop, promote, and succeed with, because it's so easy it's so much easier to go start out with something that is good but imperfect, and then gradually improve it through subsequent iterations, releasing content in a regular cycle that keeps people coming back and engaged and seeing the incremental improvement, and then contrasting the release version of the game with the version that exists 5 years later, and just being utterly astonished. Like, these games are barely even recognizable as being the same thing, and yet clearly this is the same game. It's just so much better now than it was when I set out playing it. And Magic has succeeded that way, in that has completely succeeded that way as well, right? I mean, you've seen, contrast Richard Garfield's original alpha set with the way that Magic exists today. You know, Magic is objectively just so much better as a game. I know the old school players don't agree.
I've seen that. Let's get your okay. Let's finish whatever or the Path of Exile thing. And I do want to touch up on the old like how Magic's viewed and Magic versus Hearthstone, obviously. But Path of Exile. Let's talk about Path of Exile.
Okay. Well, I mean, as far as do you have any specific questions about it?
I just know it's the Diablo 2 genre, and I just like I wanted to get or me plus the audience would love to get like any inside scoop on just your interest in general. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as far as like the relatively short explanation, just sort of promoting what the game is, it's in the action RPG genre. So I would say that genre was certainly pioneered by the Diablo series. Diablo 2 being the best, most famous example of that. That was certainly the bar that we were shooting for with our game. We basically said that we felt that there were specific things about Diablo 2 that made it so compelling, fun, addictive, the kind of game that people would throw thousands and thousands of hours at. Even when they had completely run out of things to do, there were people still just playing Diablo 2 all day, farming it, reading forums and stuff, working on builds and stuff, and hoping obviously that there would be more content to do. And of course that hope was never recognized. But it had whatever it is, and tangible and intangible things, it kind of just had the secret recipe. It really, truly did. It had the perfect mixture of everything that made a game like that great. And so we really wanted to create a modern version of Diablo 2, but that preserved everything that made it great, but added many, many additional layers on top of that to make it a more long-term thing that you could enjoy. So some people have even gone so far as to calling Path of Exile an MMO in the same vein as World of Warcraft, for example. And I don't think that the comparison is particularly fair, mainly because MMOs are built around the idea of cooperative gameplay. At the heart of every successful MMO, generally, there's cooperative gameplay, there's raiding. World of Warcraft, of course, is the best example of that, right? And World of Warcraft has been around for 16 years now. It's incredibly, incredibly venerable title at this point. Still has, by any metric, is still insanely successful. In any game, if it had World of Warcraft's current base of players, would be totally satisfied and be considered a gigantic success, even though it's not as high as it used to be. But in World of Warcraft, everything you do is almost secondary to raiding for the most part. They've added other things for players to do who want to play alone. Certainly PvP is a component of it. But most people who play World of Warcraft long-term are doing it as raiding, where you get 10 or 25 people together and you go and you do a big collective fighting a big boss, where everybody has a specifically defined role to play and everybody's an important kind of cog in a bigger machine. And Path of Exile is not like that. The game is really kind of designed to be played solo. You're allowed to party, and there's some content that's easier while partying, but most people play Path of Exile as a solo endeavor. So I don't think the comparison is really that great. But it's the very sort of typical way that action RPGs unfold. You start as a crappy little level 1 character with no equipment and no skills, and you incrementally improve your character while you go through the game's storyline. And so you progress through the game's storyline, which in the case of the current version of the game unfolds over 10 acts. So it starts in Act 1, you go to Act 2, Act 3, and so on. Every act is different. The story changes as you go. And by the time you reach Act 10 and you complete all the main game storyline, you generally have a fairly high level and usually quite effective, powerful character, at which point you enter the game's end game, which, due to our incremental improvements in the fact that we are constantly layering on new content, just like Magic expansions, once you get to the end game, there are tons of different things to do to keep you engaged in the end game. And we release new content in 3-month cycles as well. So even if you've played the game in the past, let's say you played Path of Exile when it released back in 2013, or you played in 2015 for a year or so and then drifted away from it, if you come back to the game now, it will be a very fresh and fun new experience. It will feel almost like a completely new game, which is kind of instrumental in keeping the players engaged. So we see, as far as player engagement, when you look at the release cycles, we can see the amount of people that are actually playing, and you get these huge spikes in activity and player engagement. And the concurrency levels for release days have gone up. I mean, they're gigantic. Over 200,000 people playing at any given time around when we release new expansion content and stuff. I think the record might be 218,000 concurrents. And that's just on the servers that include the United States and Europe. That doesn't include the Asia servers, which are their own thing, their own separate animal. So who knows how many people, I'm not privy to the numbers at all. But it's a lot of people certainly playing the game.
Sure.
And I remember last year, Steam, which is Our game, you can download it from the pathofexile.com website, and it's totally for free.
Link below. There's a link below.
There's no strings attached. There's no gated content in the game. 100% of the game experience is accessible to people who spend no money at all. And everything that we sell in the game, they're under the banner of this, what we call ethical microtransactions. We made a very, very distinct point when we were promoting the game initially that unlike other games, certainly freemium games today, our game would be totally egalitarian in the sense that if you succeed at Path of Exile, you're doing it through your own guile, your own intelligence, your hard work, your acumen, your skill. You're not doing it because you have daddy's credit card and you can just go and buy all the best stuff. That's not something that we would ever promote. It's not something that was ever part of our business model. We never had any interest in doing that at all. Quite the opposite, in fact. We specifically wanted to define ourselves as being different from many other games in the genre that allow people to essentially pay to win.
Pay to win.
Right, exactly. So Path of Exile was very, very adamantly anti-pay to win. And to that end, what we sell, the way that the game is monetized, we sell primarily two things. We sell cosmetic upgrades to the game in the same way that League of Legends does. So you can get reskins on your heroes and stuff, exactly. So we have reskins on skills, on items, on item effects, on monsters. What else? The characters themselves. Really, really cool armor sets and stuff. Just tons of ways to make your character look cool. We sell little pets, which have no impact on gameplay, but that run alongside of you and look cool. We sell decorations for people's hideouts, which are basically little personal encampments that players make that they can decorate and customize for themselves, which allow them, meeting places for people to hang out at. And then we sell small quality of life upgrades, generally under the broader umbrella of more or better storage space. So when somebody makes an account in Path of Exile, they get quite a generous stash space where they can stick all their items. And the stash space is shared between all the characters on the account. However, if you play the game a lot, if you play it avidly and you're not very careful with what you collect, you'll tend to fill up your stash space rather quickly. Sure. And you're left with two options. You can either make another account for free and use that as a temporary storage facility, which is what a lot of people do. And you can make unlimited amounts of those accounts. They're known as mule accounts. Or you can spend some money and buy extra storage space. And that way you've got it all consolidated on your main account. And if you buy some of that storage space, you can buy enhanced versions of that storage space. So you can buy storage space that you can colorize the tabs and name them specific things. So kind of like an index, you can find the things you're looking for. There's a certain storage tab that only stores currency in the game. So when you find all the different types of currency items in the game, you have a special tab that can store huge amounts of currency and it keeps it nicely organized for you and so on. So those are the primary things. Those are basically what we sell in the game. And it's been totally successful as far as a business model. People have totally expressed their love for it. They've totally engaged with it. And we've been able to completely monetize the game that way through that without ever having to resort to the sort of cynical ways that a lot of companies wind up actually extracting money from their player bases.
So, we're going to bang right here. Because we've been competitive gamers, do you think that has an effect on our influence of we would like things to be more of a meritocracy than, say a pay-to-win model?
Totally. I mean, I think that sentiment pervades. I mean, obviously, take poker, for example, right? The amount of people who wish that poker was a meritocracy. The best example I can think of is Phil Hellmuth, right? Phil Hellmuth, the most famous person advocating for this idea, famously saying that if poker were a game of skill, pure skill, I would never lose, right? He's famous for saying that.
Yeah, I mean, I know Phil Hellmuth, and the older I get, the higher appreciation I have for him, because whatever people think of his shtick, his goal is to keep poker alive as an industry. Like that's his end goal. So whatever his methods, and he's shifted over the years. Like I had a podcast with him. Everyone said he was it was as authentic as possible with me.
Really?
Like compared to his other.
I mean, maybe he's changed. I've only had one encounter with the guy ever. It was in, I want to say like 2000. What was the year that Chris Ferguson won the World Series? 2002, 2001.
Chris Moneymaker's 2003.
Chris Ferguson. In the final.
2000 or 2001.
Moneymaker was 03. I think this was 2000.
Yeah.
I went there, and I was there actually with Matt Place. We both went to go watch the main event, and remember how it was in 2 stages? They would play at Binion's, like all the early rounds were at Binion's, and then they would move over and play their final round at, I don't remember where the finals were. Yeah. I don't think it was at Binion's though. Maybe they were still doing it at Binion's then. I don't feel like it was.
I don't remember.
It's not important. Anyway, it was one of the early rounds, and Phil Hellmuth was actually playing, and I was a railbird. I was just watching the action from the side, and I was paying a lot of attention to it. And obviously, you know, he doesn't know me from Adam. I'm just some random guy. But I knew enough about poker at that point that I could understand a lot of the basic strategy. I could certainly watch them play and kind of figure out what they were thinking and what they were trying to do. And they had a dinner break or a rest break or something, and Phil Hellmuth was downstairs talking to a couple of people. And I stood by the side. I was patiently waiting because I wanted to ask him about a specific hand or make a comment about a specific hand that he was in. And after he was done with the two guys, they kind of walked off, and he was just standing there. And I walked up and I introduced myself, and you know, I said, I've read a lot about your poker exploits and stuff. And you know, I saw this particular hand, and I was wondering if you could, you know, either explain to me what you're thinking, or I thought, you know, I asked him a question, and he just looks at me, and he looks over my shoulder, and he just walks past me without saying a word. Just completely ignored me and blew me off completely. And I remember just standing there like utterly astonished, thinking, who the fuck does that? Like, I get, you know, maybe you're in the zone, you know, maybe you're hyper-focused on the task at hand, maybe you feel you're running poorly or whatever. But like just the general level of just pure naked disrespect, to just disregard me completely and pretend like I didn't even exist when I was asking this question. I was so disgusted, and it completely just colored how I felt about poker pros and poker celebrities going forward from that point onward. I thought to myself, sure, yeah, these guys play this game I had no money at this point in my life still. So I was completely in awe of the stakes that they played for. And sure, they play hands for tens of thousands of dollars at a time. Like it's astronomical, it's unthinkable to me. But these people are not worthy of my respect, because I know who I am, and I know about my own intelligence and aptitude at gaming. And I mean, objectively, most of these guys are probably not as skilled gamers as I am. I'm pretty certain of that. I don't know how good Phil Hellmuth is. It's really hard for me to even assess that.
He specializes in multi-table tournaments, and I give him more respect in that area than most people, but that's besides the point.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the impression that he has online, overtly in videos of him and stuff, is that he's a big donkey, you know, that he's just like, looks like he's just constantly tilted because of emotions, and he's constantly trying to make big moves that people just read him perfectly, and he gets crushed, and he's bitter as hell.
Clearly media manipulated, but you know,
obviously, yes. Yeah. It's obviously narrative, and of course he's played to that, right? He understands there's value in being the heel too.
Yes.
You know, any guy that's gonna like have himself brought out on like a throne or whatever for a game, you know, like the crazy stunts that he's pulled, right? He understands that there's definitely value to be extracted in that reputation, rightfully so. And you certainly can't argue with it.
And very fair to him, we are not his target demographic, so there's that too.
Yeah. What is his target demographic anyway?
His target demographic. Okay, so I think he doesn't want his cover blown, yet wants the respect. Like, so this is why I think I know what he does. When Barry Greenstein wrote in his book that Hellmuth is good against bad players, but bad against good players, this is kind of what it is. I've played with him in cash games. I never played with him in tournaments, but I watch him interact, and this is how he gets an extra edge in multi-table tournaments. If you or I, who are mostly polite, are dealt the same cards over and over, it plays out. But if you agitate your opponent who doesn't have emotional control, he will, like, his opponent will punt to him or just be off, and he will just like have that part of his game, like, you know, honed. So that is where he gets an extra edge, where if somebody punts off to him but doesn't punt off to you or me, wow, dude, you do increase your chances of doing well in the tournament significantly.
Yeah, no, I totally I mean, that's obviously the Mike Long strategy. I don't know if you ever played against Mike Long, but
I think I did once, but like it was
I never encountered any player in my entire career playing Magic over 26 years who ever threw me off my game more than him. No one even close. He was the only person generally that I dreaded playing against, and who I would feel would genuinely rattle me emotionally when I played against him. The only player that could do that.
What did he do?
Well, I have a famous story. I have a famous story I can relate to you about that. And I forgot. I honestly will have to get back to it, but I forgot why we were talking about Phil Hellmuth. Why I wandered off talking about that.
Your disdain for the poker players, but the thing is, that part of them, that part of their attitude, is like part of their game. Whereas our game development came from a desire of meritocracy. Like, if you are the best.
Yeah, it relates to that question. Yeah. So we'll get back to the question. We'll just keep that on the back burner, the meritocracy thing. Yeah, because that's
poker. The thing is, like, when Phil Hellmuth says he's the greatest of all time and he believes it, the thing is, like, he's playing his own game. One, in his mind of meritocracy, the only thing that really proves the best poker player of all time is multi-table tournaments and therefore bracelet events. Because even in the podcast, and I totally agree with them, it is really hard to judge who the best cash game player is, because not all fields are equal. Obviously, for somebody like you and me who care more about, I mean, we would love to have the titles, but we're playing poker for money, so we care about the cash more. But Phil Hellmuth's poker legacy is very important to him personally for many reasons, and I think you and I at least have the appreciation that with the games that we participate in, we would like whatever we contributed to be acknowledged. So he wants that acknowledgement of being the greatest poker player of all time, but on his terms, which are multi-table tournaments, bracelets, keeping the game alive, being in poker history. And I think that when people diss him, one, he's been portrayed in media unfairly, in a sense that a lot of the hands that are on video are the entertaining ones where he blows up or whatnot.
Yeah, obviously there's huge confirmation bias involved in the production of this.
Right. And on at least Live at the Bike, I have seen him like outwit people or whatever. Cash games are not a specialty. But in the context of his definition of greatest poker player of all time, he actually fits that caveat, in which if you're trying to define him in a different sense, easily he's not the best player of all time. So one thing that poker does as a game versus Magic has a little bit as a component, as you showed with Mike Long, is you're trying to break parity. You don't want the meritocracy. You're trying to find whatever you can do, whether it's strategically, verbally, gestures, whatever, in an ethical sense,
right,
to break parity. And he does that. Like, definitely people like Antonio Esfandiari and Phil Hellmuth and Phil Locke, their speech play attempts to break this parity.
Interesting.
So that's something that we, as, even though it's a very small component of Magic, live Magic, for the most part, you personally want to be known in Magic as a theorist, deck builder, and execution, not so much the manipulation.
Right, exactly.
You do have part of that in you, but that's why. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say you're totally right about that. I mean, I think obviously doing things within the confines of the rules. You're obviously familiar with the term angle shooting, and you have to be careful about walking that line between strategy, getting into your opponent's head, manipulation, and overt angle shooting, right? And I think that probably it's somewhere in between the getting in your opponent's head and actually angle shooting where you start to fall into territory where most people would consider that, reputable or disreputable conduct, to the point where people would start to really frown on you as a player and as a person. And I don't know I don't think that I would qualify or classify any of Phil Hellmuth's shenanigans as angle shooting.
Exactly.
They're not. They're definitely within the confines of the game. And certainly, acting tilted about stuff, berating people for their play. Sure, it makes you look like an asshole, but in a game where you are trying to extract every dollar of potential equity, because it can't just be a meritocracy. Obviously, it can't be, because then it's just a zero-sum game in the long run. You do need to exert some sort of thing. I mean, in the case of Magic, for example, I've got them right here. To this day, when I play old school, these are two 20-sided dice.
Yeah.
These two dice, not these exact two, but two dice play an integral part of my strategy to this day, because the physical aspect of manipulating a 20-sided die in terms of what you can project to your opponent and how much you can get people to actually block or not block or take damage or do whatever by just literally picking up a die and adjusting it. It's profound, actually, the effect that this can have on people, where you say, I'm going to attack you for 2, and you reach over and you just pick their die up and you start to turn it. And that this is not demonstrative of anything, right? They have to legally declare a block and then there's time to do everything. But when you pick the die up and you start to turn it, they get fixated by that and they start thinking, damn, I don't really want to take 2. Like, he's picked up the die, or that's awfully presumptuous of him to pick the die up and start turning. I haven't even declared a block yet. Fuck yeah, I'm going to block, which is exactly what you want them to do, which is why you picked up the die in the first place. And they don't even realize that you did that was an overt choice. I specifically picked the die up because I'm trying to induce them to block, and I want them to resent the fact that I picked the die up. That's like a little sort of intangible thing that's obviously within the confines of the rules completely. It's not angle shooting. There's no cheating going on there, but clearly there's some degree of manipulation going on there, even if it's rather covert. And I guess, so Phil Hellmuth's strategies are kind of in line with that. And I can totally understand that. I can totally get it. I just, obviously from my perspective, that's not how I would ever try to eke out an advantage.
Right. Because of our background, and we don't view like...
Well, particularly on the subject of legacy, what kind of legacy is he trying to have? You know, does he want to be infamous and known for all time as one of the most abrasive, awful people who ever sat at a poker table and made countless opponents just feel horrible?
He's fairly proud of that, but that's not so much like, if you listen to all his dialogue, and I'm wondering how many people are actually going to listen to this that, you know, also have the crossover. But what's important to him are bracelets, longevity, what people are like, whether he could say he's the greatest, and actual performance. If that is his criteria, and he's, you know, relatively proud of being a brat, so call that irrelevant. Yeah. Because I think that if being kind and not abrasive was the correct strategy, he's happy to do that too. I've seen a nice side to him that other people may not have seen. Whatever the case is, under those four criteria, which, you know, longevity is a huge one, because that's something that's hard for, you know, poker players in general.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it seems like a crazy thing to want to do with your life for 30 years or 40 years. I mean, it's just...
That's right. That's for us, but he's been passionate about it for, like, you know, when you were playing Street Fighter and then Magic and then, you know, Diablo.
Exactly. Helmuth was playing poker the whole time, of course.
Yeah, Helmuth's been playing the whole time. So in the context of his definition, and I'm not even sure it's like that off, he really is like one of the greats. Like, there's no...
Indisputably, yes, of course.
I just mean under his own definition.
I think an objective definition he would. I mean, does he have the most bracelets still? He does, yeah. Right?
He has 15. Yeah.
But then it's indisputable. Honestly, that's the biggest litmus test, I think, of someone truly being great, is how many gigantic events have you won? Because it's not like you can just play in every event and you just accumulate bracelets over time, right? That's not how it works.
There's one caveat to that, which is when people are sponsored, especially like Daniel Negreanu, so you could just keep spamming tournaments, then yeah, that's kind of messing with stuff. But that's the thing. That's why, you know, a poker career isn't so much of a meritocracy, because there are so many things that make it that it's not a fair competition. And whether it's like talk, play, strategy, there is a lot of stuff to manipulate things, because your whole goal is to break parity.
Yeah. Well, on the subject of meritocracy in games, getting back to that initial point that you made, I think that there is definitely a tendency among cerebral, skilled lifestyle players. There's always this tendency to sort of drift in that direction over time, particularly because once you develop prodigious skill at something, be it poker or Magic or whatever, it engenders a degree of expectation about the outcome of every single game you play. You start to have the expectation. You transition, particularly when you're learning something that people already understand better than you because they've been doing it longer. You start out with this expectation, like I'm just going to have fun, I'm just going to do this, and I'm going to learn it. And then gradually transition, once you gain aptitude at that, you transition over to starting to have the expectation that you should win more than your fair share of games. As you get very, very good at something, that gives way to being almost a sense of entitlement, right?
Yes,
I deserve to win these games, right? I not only expect to, but I deserve to, because I put in the time. I know this better than anyone. These are the kind of things you hear Phil Allen saying at the table, right? Which makes him so distasteful to so many people. I deserve to win this. I'm entitled to win this. And if there's one thing that people generally react to universally badly, it's a sense of entitlement. People generally can't stand people who act entitled. The problem is that when you really have spent and put in the time, it's hard to not feel entitled to a certain degree to the wins.
I agree. Talk about more extensively, and what the inspiration for this podcast is basically what happens to these competitive gamers like later on in life, because often the stereotype is like gamers are losers or whatnot. And even in talk shows like Jimmy Kimmel or something, and just like, or even Joe Rogan, who, I mean, I like both of those guys, and they just like rip on gaming, and it's just like,
yeah, I found that I saw just a little glimpse of that. I found it to be incredibly irresponsible and just so arrogant and needlessly condescending.
Yeah, so it's tough because like, and the gamers that Jimmy Kimmel had on the show, it's like they were so apparent, like they felt similar, like to me, at least me, where like I like Jimmy Kimmel, I enjoy his show, and for him to like say these things is like
very jarring.
Yeah, it's just like, I don't want to say anything bad about Jimmy Kimmel or Joe Rogan, because I admire their product, but it really like makes me put a wall up now in distance and be like, oh well, I better take care of myself, you know?
Yeah, well, people are complicated, right? This speaks to a larger issue that I think is very pervasive in the country right now, particularly with regards to politics. And obviously I think we should eschew politics for the most part, but I think that one of the fundamentally underlying deep problems in the country right now is this idea of tribalism, and the fact that if you're a member of the tribe, you don't question the orthodoxy or the leader of that tribe, no matter how contemptible and reprehensible that person actually is. And so with regards to your feelings towards both Jimmy Kimmel and Joe Rogan, like, you know, you can be part of Team Joe Rogan, you can be in the Rogan, you know, the Rogan podcast tribe. And I'm sure that Rogan's podcast has been very inspirational to you and very instructional.
Oh, very, yeah.
Tremendously, right? So it's very hard to look at him and say, okay, well, I admire this guy and what he's accomplished, and he's a tremendously good model for what I might like to aspire to. But then he's saying this completely outrageous shit that's so ignorant that it's really hard for me to, you know, I can't really jive those two ideas in my mind. It's hard for me to really, but that's really okay. And I think it's important to recognize the fact that it's okay to really be a fan of somebody, while at the same time being critical of specific positions that they hold. Nuance is fine. Like, we get that. Smart people understand nuance. You don't need to be tribal. You know, you don't need to doggedly just adhere to a specific person to the point where you won't criticize them. That's actually it's not even doing them a favor. People need to be called out when they say stupid shit. You know, if I was friends with Joe Rogan, I would say to him, dude, what the hell are you doing? That's incredibly irresponsible. There's tens of millions of people who love and listen to your podcast who are avid gamers. What are you doing, man? Like, this position is obviously wrong. It's just objectively wrong.
I put up a kind of a wall, and kind of like, I'm still a fan of him, but like, my narrative, especially this conversation, is more for people who are like teenagers that need to hear that if they're avid gamers, they don't even have to be like elite competitors. If you're elite competitors, you're going to find a way. But even if you're a pretty strong, pretty bright guy, you could turn your life into great things. But narratives like Jimmy Kimmel or Joe Rogan that make you sound like you're going to be a loser, that's just like not true.
Objectively not true. And it just does make them sound ignorant. One of the things that I've always said is something that I've really tried to define my life by, no matter what it is that when I choose to do something, I just take it seriously. I think that's a mantra that you can adhere to. This is something that I've tried to really, I have a 10-year-old son. His name is Desmond. He's 10 and a half. One of the things I've tried to instill in Desi is this idea that take the things you do seriously. Give them the respect that they deserve. That when you treat something with respect, when you treat obviously other people with respect and their views about the things that they do with respect, the net benefit is gigantic. And respect, fundamentally respecting something is so instrumental to understanding it as well, to understanding the perspective of people who enjoy it. Jimmy Kimmel and Joe Rogan's perspective on gaming was obviously very overtly and needlessly disrespectful of that activity. It's the idea that this is an activity that I don't understand, that I don't partake in. Therefore, those who do it are not worthy of my respect. They're only worthy of my derision. And that's just such an obviously wrong and ignorant way to view your fellow man and the world in general. But when it comes to just things in general, like gaming endeavors or whatever it is you do it with passion, do it with respect, and really take it seriously, no matter what it is. If you're in a PE class and the coach asks you to go run a quarter mile, or he asks you to do sit-ups or square dancing or whatever the hell they're out asking kids to do in PE classes, take it seriously. Just do it. It doesn't hurt you to take something seriously. People may mock you, but those people, the people that don't take shit seriously in their lives, they will almost consistently end up in a position doing something that they hate. When you take your life seriously, when you take everything you do and you give it a degree of respect, and you really throw your intelligence and your work ethic and your discipline into it, also taking stuff seriously gives you the opportunity to find out whether it really is a passion or not, whether you are in fact good at it. If you never take anything seriously, you can never find out that you even have any aptitude at it at all. You'll never really even discover that this might be the thing that you're meant to do, because you just treated it with insincerity and with a lack of respect. Gaming is certainly true in that way.
Yeah, so that's something that I noticed recently in the last few years.
You have to defer to the will of the group, the will of the collective.
Yeah, and of course, like this podcast in general is more of a defense and like an encouragement. Like if you are a young person proficient in games and everybody around you is like saying, this is bad, this is what it's like. There are so many career paths. There's like incredibly successful people, Brian Weissman included, and just like, I'm communicating personal experiences. So for the people that know me on broadcast and the stuff I'm gonna do in the future, whatever credibility I have, I'm gonna be like, my experiences with you were, incredibly positive. And just like I said, for a lot of the, you mentoring like a lot of people, but the mentorship you gave me, a lot of lessons, I got to execute them in future times in Magic when you weren't around, and it was because of these small things that you did. I remember them for. Whereas like, I have a lot of gaming experiences. Like, yeah. Honestly, I don't remember squat.
It's very heartening to hear that. I mean, obviously that's the goal. I've said this many times that I owe nearly all of the success in my life, honestly, to the fact that I happened to have discovered Magic in 1994. And getting back to what I was saying, I took it very seriously from the moment that I saw it. I just recognized there's something special here, and I feel that this is worthy of my time, my intellectual devotion, my work ethic, study, everything. That this is really something that I feel I could sort of recognize and find myself in. And even though I had countless detractors, friends and family among them, foremost among them, and people teasing me for it and so on, I always was confident that I was doing the right thing, because I felt driven in a way that I had never felt driven about anything else. And that's what I would say to kids, that are really into gaming. And nowadays, obviously, it's much easier for people to point at real success stories. There are people making literally millions of dollars a year as professional gamers. Those people, unfortunately, just like professional sports athletes, are the anomalies. They're not a general reflection of how a normal person can go. But you can't know if you're going to be one of those people unless you at least try. And try as hard as you can and be confident that you're doing the right thing. Believe in yourself and believe in your long-term goals. You just have to be secure in the notion that you know better for yourself than other people do. You just have to be secure in that notion. And I always was. I always felt, even during the super lean years when Magic wasn't giving me any money, I knew that I was doing things, changing and working and developing my mind and my relationships in a way that would pay dividends later. And it absolutely did. Everyone that I know that led to me being successful in game development and in business in general was all an outgrowth of those years that I invested in Magic. It was a completely integral and irreplaceable part of it. It never happened. Like, nothing in my life that I've enjoyed in the last 15 years happens if I don't devote myself completely to Magic for that period of time that I did. In defiance of many people's judgment, certainly in their assessment, and obviously at being a victim of substantial amounts of criticism from friends and family.
So people like you, JC Everson, was the co-founder of chess.com, Dennis Fong, Quake, Doom 2, Quake 2 world champion. Those guys, like you guys all were a good influence on me, not just for being incredibly strong in the games you participate in, but also at some point realizing, okay, we're at a certain age and it's time for us to bring value to the world. Like, just because you play games, like, games have this bad reputation of you're wasting time, where it's like, clearly some people do waste their time and waste their lives away. But if, like, you hear from this podcast how passionate Brian Weissman is about Magic the Gathering and the other games he's competing in, like Street Fighter 2, but this is just a tip of the iceberg. Like, even my experiences with you is a tip of the iceberg, but I can feel the passion, and at some point we're just like, okay, we've done our bit in gaming history as a competitor. It's time to spend time to build something of value. In your case, the item sales in Diablo 2 and then Path of Exile and then whatever else you have in the future. That's a transition that is not defended and not documented in the public, that this podcast is supposed to enlighten.
Yeah, I'd certainly say in sort of modern times, as far as kind of giving back, I think that certainly my YouTube channel and my general continued advocacy for the game. I mean, I've done other YouTube videos and written some articles and stuff as well to sort of try to further it. But always, certainly my highest priority right now, given the fact that we do sort of feel the weight of legacy at this point, and that we've kind of done a lot of the things that people sort of set out to do initially, as far as making a name for yourself, gaining renown and fame and recognition and so on. That, yeah, I think at this stage of my life, certainly it's just teaching, getting back to teaching. I mean, I love to teach. I love to introduce an entire generation, not of children, but of players who are kind of stepping out of the casual confines of what they've been doing. Yeah. And really taking the first steps into really beginning to understand how to play Magic correctly, and understanding the sort of underlying things that make Magic decks work, that you should be looking for while you play, the sort of what I said a long time ago, the sort of goal-oriented thinking and pursuing how to play a game of Magic. People are often sending me commander decks that they've developed for critique. And one of the common things that I always say at first to them, and before I even start to talk, I say, well, can you summarize to me, what is this deck's game plan? What is it hoping to achieve in every game? And if you can't summarize what the deck's game plan is in a couple of sentences, it's not built correctly, you're not doing it right. And I think that that's one of the many things that I've been trying to impart to people, as far as educating them to play Magic in a broader sense. It's hard to reach a broad audience, particularly because I tend to be very verbose, and I'm not
here. I told you, unlimited time. So
yeah, and I'm not into nuance a lot either, and a lot of my points require a lot of framing and backstory and so on. And so I think that some people would probably lose patience with what I have to say. But the truth of the matter is that there really aren't very many things in life that are worth knowing that you can learn about quickly. Very, very few things, and certainly no skills that are worth having that don't take upwards of years and years of time to cultivate. All the things that really are worth, the skill sets that are worth having are that way because they're hard. You have to be willing to really, there's no substitute for putting in the time to really studying things in a way that other people may not have looked at them. You have to do that. I mean, because if you're not doing that, then you're just the same as everybody else who's just a dilettante, who's just dabbling at it, and it will never, ever achieve mastery skill at anything. Most people never achieve mastery skill at anything, which is unfortunate.
I agree, but mastery is such a relative term too, because my performances in 3 real-time games were top notch, but I didn't play perfect in any of them, even the deciding world championship games. I may have won it, but I know what mistakes I made. And same thing with athletes, or I mean, something like Magic or Hearthstone, you might be able to quantify that you played perfectly, but real-time games, there's always something you could do.
Right. There's just too many variables, and the decision trees are infinite, almost essentially infinite. I think when I'm talking about mastery skills, I'm not talking about it in a purely literal sense. This is more in the idea that you've just cultivated a skill that's, in the 99.9th percentile. The kind of thing where the average person who does it will never, ever be able to attain that degree of skill without a similar amount of dedication, regardless of talent or whatever. But also the kind of thing that when people see it, the average casual player sees it, they're just utterly in awe, and they think that you do things that no person should ever reasonably be able to attain. It's that kind of degree of skill that you've cultivated in something. It doesn't mean that you win every championship event, and certainly, the best, like the 10th best golfer in the world might win a major like once in his career. He's still the 10th best golfer in the world, right? He may never win a tournament, but he's so insanely good, and he's better than the millions and millions and millions of people who actively play golf. He clearly has mastery. Even the 100th best golfer, the 1,000th best golfer in the world, still has tremendous mastery ability, even though he's not going to ever be on the podium.
And so there's a lot of,
you don't have to be the best. Just be great and just take it seriously. I'm gonna turn on my light real quick here.